Rosalie Voss didn't wait for Mara to even set her bag down. She was standing in the middle of Caldwell's Main Street when the stage rolled in, arms folded across her chest, like a woman who had been waiting to deliver a verdict. She wore a dress that cost more than most families in Burnt Creek County spent on food in a winter month, and she wore it the way people wear armor deliberately, to remind everyone else what they weren't. Mara stepped off the stage and felt the mud immediately, cold and thick, through the thin sole of her left boot where the stitching had started to separate outside of Cheyenne. "That's her," Rosalie said, loud enough that the three women behind her could hear. Not whispering, not bothering, the mail-order bride. "Look at her, one bag." She let out a short laugh, the kind designed to sound involuntary. "Silas Rourke must be more desperate than I thought." Mara stopped walking. She looked at the woman. She did not look away. "I wonder," Rosalie continued, tilting her head slightly, "how long before she runs like the others did? 2 weeks? 1? Mara picked up her bag and kept moving. But the words followed her all the way down the street, and they would follow her for weeks after that, into a broken kitchen, into a dead garden, into the cold silence of 7 boys who had already decided she wasn't worth knowing. If that was you, if you stepped off that stage with $41 and a bag that was half empty in a town already laughing at you before you'd spoken a single word, what would you have done? Before we go further, if stories like this one speak to something in you, stories about women who didn't fold when the world expected them to, I'd ask you to subscribe to this channel and follow Mara's story all the way to the end. Hit the like button and leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1884, and the moment everything began. The Rourke Ranch sat 7 miles east of Caldwell, at the end of a road that was barely a road, more a suggestion carved into the hard Wyoming earth by wagon wheels that hadn't changed course in 20 years. Mara sat in the back of a borrowed supply wagon driven by a man named Orlin who worked for the general store and who had offered her the ride because Silas Rourke had asked him to, apparently, though Silas himself had not come to collect her. That told her something right away. Orlin didn't say much. He was the kind of man who seemed to believe that silence was a form of respect, which Mara appreciated more than she let on. She had been on a train for 2 days before that, and before the train there had been the letter, 2 letters, actually. And before the letters there had been 6 months of trying to make the numbers in her life add up to something that resembled a future, and failing at it consistently. She was 31 years old. She had no family left, no land, no savings worth naming. She had a set of skills that were real and hard-earned, and she had a stubbornness that people in her life had called a flaw for so long that she had almost believed them. The advertisement had read, "Widower with 7 sons, working ranch outside Caldwell, Wyoming, seeking capable woman for household management and care. Arrangement practical references exchanged. Respond to S. Rourke, Box 14. She had stared at that advertisement for 4 days before she answered it. She told herself she was practical about it. This was work. This was a position. She was not a young woman, dreaming of romance with a stranger in the mountains. She was a grown woman who needed income and a roof, and Silas Rourke needed someone who could run a household that had clearly stopped running on its own. It was a transaction, and transactions she understood. She had written him a straightforward letter. No romanticism. She told him what she could do, what she had done, and what she expected in return: fair treatment, a private room if available, and wages to be discussed in person. She did not tell him about the last 2 years, about the shop that had failed, about her mother's death and the debt that came with it, about the particular humiliation of watching everything you'd worked for dissolve. He had written back in 4 sentences. She was welcome. The boys needed structure. Pay was $40 a month plus room and board. The stage arrived Tuesday. That was the whole of their courtship. She had told herself on the train that expectations were the enemy of survival. You didn't walk into a struggling ranch expecting a warm greeting and a clean house. You walked in with your eyes open and your hands ready, and you dealt with what was actually there instead of what you'd imagined. What was actually there, it turned out, was considerably worse than she'd imagined. The wagon came around a long rise, and the ranch appeared below a main house, 2 outbuildings, a barn that looked structurally uncertain on its east side, a series of fence lines in various states of repair, and a yard that suggested years of neglect rather than months. The kitchen garden beside the house was completely dead, not dormant. Dead the way things go when nobody has touched them at all. Mara studied all of it without speaking. Orlin pulled the wagon to a stop near the front of the house and set the brake. "Here you are," he said. She waited a moment. Then she climbed down, taking her bag with her, and stood in the yard. The front door opened. What came out was not Silas Rourke. It was a young man, 19, maybe 20 tall and lean, with his father's dark hair and a jaw set like a trap. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and looked at her the way you look at a problem that has arrived ahead of schedule. "You're the woman from the advertisement," he said. Not a question. "Mara Ellison," she said. "You're one of the Rourke boys." "Caleb." He said it without warmth, without welcome, without the smallest gesture that suggested he had any interest in making this easier. "Pa's in the south field. He'll be in by supper." He looked at her bag. "You can put your things in the room at the end of the hall. Second door on the right. Don't go into the other rooms." Then he turned and went back inside. Orland cleared his throat on the wagon seat. "Good luck to you, Miss Ellison," he said. And he clicked to the horses and turned them around, and she was alone in the yard with her one bag and a kitchen garden that looked like a eulogy. She picked up her bag and went inside. The first thing she registered was the smell. Not a single bad smell exactly, but a collection of them unwashed linens, old grease, something that had been left on a stove and forgotten, mud tracked in and dried and tracked in again. The kitchen was to the left of the front entrance, and she stopped in the doorway of it and took stock. The table was large enough to seat 10, and currently seated approximately 2 weeks of unwashed dishes and a collection of objects that had no business being in a kitchen: a broken harness buckle, several lengths of rope, what appeared to be a child's boot. The stove was functional but needed cleaning badly. The shelves were nearly empty: a partial sack of flour, a tin of lard, some salt, coffee that was almost gone, 2 dried-up onions that had been there long enough to have shriveled. She stood there for a long moment. Then she set her bag down against the wall, rolled up her sleeves, and started with the dishes. She was halfway through when she heard them come in, not all at once, but in a slow tide, the way children enter a space when they've been told there's a stranger in the house and aren't sure whether to be curious or hostile. The first was small, maybe 7 or 8, with a gap in his front teeth and hair that needed cutting 2 months ago. He stood at the kitchen doorway and stared at her with enormous dark eyes. "You're not supposed to touch Mama's dishes," he said. Mara kept washing. "These dishes aren't being touched," she said. "They're being cleaned. There's a difference." The boy considered this. She always washed them a certain way. "What's your name?" A pause. "Noah." "How long has it been since they were washed at all, Noah?" He thought about it honestly. The way children do when they haven't yet learned to manage the truth for other people's comfort. "A while," he admitted. "Then I'd say your mother would be glad someone's doing it." She glanced at him. "You can stand there or you can dry, your choice." He stood there for another 30 seconds, working out whether this was a trap. Then he came in, picked up the drying cloth from the hook beside the sink without being told where to find it, and started to dry the dishes she passed him. More of them appeared after that, 1 at a time, then 2. Then in a cluster ranging in age from Noah's 7 or 8 down to a set of twins who looked about 5, and up to a lanky boy of maybe 15, who took one look at what was happening in the kitchen and retreated back into the hallway as if he hadn't been there at all. Caleb didn't return. She could hear him somewhere at the back of the house, moving around in a way that communicated his opinion without requiring words. By the time the table was cleared and the dishes were done, she had collected the names of 4 of the 7 brothers: Noah, the serious small one, who dried dishes with the concentration of a much older child; Thomas and Daniel, the twins, who had appointed themselves observers from the corner, and who moved in an eerie, synchronized way that suggested they did most things together; and Eli, 13, who had come in, eaten a biscuit from the tin she'd found tucked at the back of a shelf, and left without introducing himself until Noah told her his name for him. She was starting on the stove when Silas Rourke came in. She heard the door and then boots on the floorboards, and she turned around with a rag still in her hand. He was not what she'd expected, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that she'd expected something. He was perhaps 42, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of tired that gets into a person's face and stays there, not exhaustion exactly, but a weight that sleep doesn't fully touch. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples. He had a beard that needed attention. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and then at the kitchen behind her, at the clean table, at the organized shelves, at the stove. She was in the middle of wiping down, and something moved behind his eyes that was hard to name. "Miss Ellison," he said. "Mr. Rourke." He looked like he wanted to say something and wasn't sure where to start. He settled for, "You didn't have to do all this tonight. The dishes were unsanitary," she said without judgment, just information. "And I needed to know what I was working with before I could plan anything." He was quiet for a moment. "Caleb show you your room? He told me where it was." Silas rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, a gesture she would come to recognize as his particular way of moving when he was uncomfortable without knowing how to say so. "Boys been any trouble?" "No," she said. "Noah helped with the dishes." That surprised him. She could see it. "He did?" "He did." Silas looked toward the hallway, as if he could see through the wall to wherever Noah had gone. Then he looked back at Mara. "I'll get cleaned up," he said. "We can talk after supper." She nodded and turned back to the stove. Supper was a revelation in what could be done with almost nothing, which was a skill she'd developed over the last 2 years through necessity rather than artistry. The flour, the lard, the partial can of beans she'd found at the back of a lower cabinet, the 2 onions chopped fine, the small piece of salted pork she'd discovered. Wrapped in cloth in the cold box, it became something. Not a feast, but a meal that smelled like a meal and sat on the table in enough quantity that nobody left hungry. All 7 boys ate. She learned the rest of their names across the table. James, who was 16 and said almost nothing but ate with great seriousness. William, 11, who asked her 3 questions in a row before Caleb shot him a look that silenced him. And Henry, 9, who spilled his water and looked at Mara with the frozen terror of a child who has been yelled at for spilling before. She handed him the drying cloth without comment and told him to clean it up. He did. Nobody yelled. Caleb ate quickly and left the table first. She noticed how the younger boys tracked his movements, how the room seemed to calibrate itself around his moods. He was not cruel to them. He was something more complicated than that. He was the one who had held things together, or tried to, and that kind of position changes a person in ways that aren't entirely visible. After supper, Silas sat with her at the cleared kitchen table, with a lamp between them and the account book open. This was the conversation she'd been steeling herself for since she'd seen the kitchen. "It's not a prosperous ranch," he said, which was a significant understatement. "I can see that," she said, also an understatement. He told her about the cattle prices, falling since last spring, expected to fall further. He had a banknote coming due in March, about 6 months out. He told her about the last 2 women who'd tried to manage the household, both of whom had left within a fortnight. He told her this with the flat voice of someone reporting damage assessments, not asking for sympathy. She asked him about the north pasture she'd seen from the wagon road. He said there was timber up there, worth cutting if someone had the time to negotiate a sale. She filed that away. She asked about the chicken coop she'd seen was empty. He said one of the boys had left a gate open 2 years ago, and they'd lost most of the flock to a fox and never replaced them. He said it without accusation, but she noticed he didn't say which boy. She asked about the garden. He was quiet for a long time. "That was my wife's," he said. "I know," Mara said. "I'll need seeds in the spring if I stay that long." He looked at her. "You think you might not?" She thought about Rosalie Voss on the main street of Caldwell, about Caleb's face in the doorway, about the 4-month-old dishes. "I think a lot can happen in 6 months," she said. "But I don't quit easily." He nodded once, like he was marking something in a column. After they agreed on the basic terms, the same ones from his letter, plus a few additions she put forward that he accepted without argument, which told her more about how badly he needed help than anything else had she went to her room. It was small, a narrow bed, a washstand, a hook on the wall, a window that looked east toward a fence line, cold enough that she could see her breath if she turned toward the door and away from the small stove. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her one bag and thought, "This is what I have. This is where I am. Now figure out what to do with it." She was tired in a way that was more than physical tired, in the way of someone who had been making hard decisions alone for a long time, and had grown competent at it but not comfortable. She did not cry. She was past crying as a first response. She sat with the weight of the situation the way you sit with a map you have to read before you can go anywhere. She thought about Rosalie Voss laughing on the street. About the word desperate, she thought. Fine, let her think that. She did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, it was with the sound of Wyoming wind against the window glass, and the knowledge that somewhere in this broken house, 7 boys were sleeping who had already lost more than they should have by their ages, and a man who had no idea how to ask for help from anyone, including the woman he'd just invited into his house. She thought about the garden. She was going to have to plan the spring plantings even before the ground thawed, if she wanted to get ahead of it. Tomatoes, beans, squash, whatever would actually grow at this elevation. She made a mental list before she slept. In the morning, she was up before anyone else. She started a proper fire in the kitchen stove, set water to heat, and went out in the cold before dawn to look at the north pasture from the fence line. The timber Silas had mentioned was there, all right, a good stand of it, the kind that a mill operation might pay real money for if approached correctly. She stood at the fence and studied it with her arms crossed over her coat, and the first light barely beginning to come over the ridge. And she thought about the account book she'd seen the night before, and the numbers in it that didn't balance, and the 6 months between now and March. She went back inside and made breakfast. The boys came down in 1s and 2s, still sleep slow, wary of her in the way you're wary of something you don't know the rules of yet. She put food in front of them. She did not try to make conversation. She did not try to make them like her. She put food in front of them and let the rest develop at its own pace. Caleb was the last one in. He stopped when he saw the eggs, real eggs, from somewhere she'd found without asking, and looked at her with something that was not quite suspicion and not quite surprise. "Where'd you find those?" he said. "Back corner of the cold box," she said. "Someone wrapped them in cloth. Practical." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he sat down and ate. She poured him coffee without asking. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't push it away. That afternoon, while the older boys were out working with Silas, she found the thing that changed the nature of the next several weeks. In the root cellar, which she'd gone into looking for preserved food, and found mostly empty shelves and disappointment, she found, on the far back wall behind a broken shelf that had tilted forward, 3 sealed crocks of preserves, a shelf of cured meat she hadn't seen in the dim light, and approximately 40 pounds of winter vegetables that someone had stored and then apparently forgotten, or left more likely before the last housekeeper went. She stood in the root cellar with a lantern and looked at the food that nobody had known was there, and she felt the first thing close to relief she'd felt since arriving. Not because it solved everything. It solved nothing, really, in the grand scheme of what this ranch owed and what it needed. But it meant she could feed 7 boys and a man through the winter, without improvising every single day, which meant she could spend at least a portion of her time on the bigger problems. She came up from the root cellar and started planning. Over the following week, she established a routine that was less about authority and more about structure, which the boys, she noticed, actually needed far more than they needed rules. Meals at predictable times, laundry on a schedule, chores that were clear and assigned rather than vague and collectively ignored. She didn't try to be their mother. She never once positioned herself that way. She was the person who made the household run, and she ran it the way a competent person runs anything, consistently, practically, without drama. The younger boys adapted first, as children usually do. Noah became her shadow in the kitchen, absorbing everything, without seeming to try. The twins decided she was acceptable when she fixed a toy horse that Thomas had broken and that had apparently been unfixable for weeks. Eli stopped taking biscuits without asking and started asking instead. William, 11 and relentlessly curious, finally got to ask his questions when Caleb wasn't at the table, and Mara answered all of them about where she was from, about what she'd done before, about whether she'd ever seen a real buffalo, which she had once from a distance in Kansas. William received this information as a significant gift. Henry, 9 and quiet in a way that suggested he was watching more than he let on, started appearing in the kitchen in the afternoons. He didn't offer to help. He just sat at the corner of the table and watched her work. She let him. She didn't make it a thing. She just let him sit there until sitting there was ordinary. Caleb was another problem entirely. She had been at the ranch 10 days when the first real confrontation happened. She had reorganized the kitchen shelves, not arbitrarily, but out of functional necessity, because the previous arrangement made it impossible to find anything efficiently. It was a practical change. She thought it was obvious it was practical. Caleb came in that evening and opened the cabinet where his mother had kept the coffee, and the coffee wasn't there anymore. She'd moved it to the shelf above the stove, where it was actually easier to access from the fire. He stood with his hand on the empty cabinet door and said nothing, and the silence was so loud it pressed against the walls. "I moved the coffee," she said. She was at the table, working through the household accounts she'd asked Silas if she could review. Upper shelf. Easier to reach when you're standing at the stove. He turned and looked at her with a fury that was not about coffee. "You don't have the right to move things. I have the right to organize a kitchen I'm supposed to be managing," she said, keeping her voice level. "The coffee is 3 feet to the left of where it was. You have no idea what you're moving. You have no idea what any of this means." She put down the pencil. "You're right," she said. "I don't know what your kitchen was like before. I don't know your mother. I didn't have the right to move things without saying so first, and I should have asked." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry for that. I'll ask in the future." That stopped him. She could see it. He'd been wound up for a confrontation, and she'd offered him an honest apology instead, which was harder to fight with. He stood there for a moment, with the argument in his hands and nowhere to put it. "Don't touch her garden," he said finally, voice lower. "Not until spring I wasn't going to," Mara said. "That's the one thing I was going to leave alone, until you and your father decided together what you wanted done with it." He left the kitchen, but the coffee stayed where she'd put it, and in the morning he poured himself a cup from it without saying anything at all. It was not peace, but it was something. The second week she began teaching the 3 youngest boys their letters and numbers in the evenings, after supper, because it turned out Noah could barely read, and the twins could not at all. She did this at the kitchen table, with a slate and a short stub of chalk she'd found, making no announcement and no ceremony. She just started, and the boys came to it because they had nothing else to do, and because there was a kind of novelty in it that was hard to resist. William tried to involve himself immediately, but she sent him to help James with a harness repair, because James, she had noticed, was carrying a loneliness that the younger boys didn't feel yet, the particular loneliness of being too old to need supervision and too young to be truly independent. He needed the company more than the lesson. Silas watched all of this from his particular remove. He was not an absent man. He worked the ranch hard, came home tired and quiet, ate what she put in front of him, treated her with a careful courtesy that had a formality to it she couldn't quite read. He did not interfere with how she managed the household. He answered her questions about the ranch directly and without evasion. He did not, she noticed, watch her the way a man watches a woman he finds interesting. He watched her the way a man watches someone he can't quite categorize, which was perhaps more honest. She did not think about Silas Rourke in terms of anything except the problem of the ranch, which was a good and useful way to think about him. On the 14th day, she found the rest of the accounts. She'd asked Silas for the full picture, all of it, not just the household accounts, and he'd handed her a second ledger without much comment. She had spent an evening going through it, and what she found was worse than she'd suspected from the conversation on the first night. The note due in March was larger than he'd said, or rather, he hadn't said the full number. The banknote was only part of it. There was also a debt to a supply company in Cheyenne, a smaller one to a neighbor, and an equipment loan from 2 years ago that had been rolled over once already. She sat at the kitchen table after everyone was in bed and looked at the numbers and did the arithmetic 3 different ways, in case she'd made an error. She hadn't. If cattle prices dropped 15% as expected, they would not make the March payment, not without additional income from somewhere. She sat for a long time with that fact. Then she picked up her pencil and started writing. She wrote out every asset on the property that wasn't currently generating income: the timber in the north pasture, the hay surplus from the east field that Silas had mentioned in passing, the empty chicken coop, the wagon that sat idle half the year. She wrote out every expense that could be reduced. She crossed things out. She moved numbers around. She worked the problem from several different angles over the course of 2 hours. By the time the lamp was low, she had the beginning of something that might, if everything went reasonably and nothing else broke, be enough to bridge the gap. She sat back and looked at what she'd written and thought, he has to know about this. He has to understand how close this is. She thought about how to tell him. Not to frighten him, he was already afraid. She was certain of that, in the way men who carry everything alone are afraid, quietly, where it doesn't show. But he needed to know that someone else knew and that there was a plan worth trying. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket and decided to wait for the right moment. That moment came 2 days later, in the early evening, when Silas came in from the south fence and found her at the kitchen table with the account book and the folded paper and a cup of coffee waiting for him. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the setup and understood immediately that this was not an ordinary evening. He sat down. She told him plainly what she'd found. She told him the real number, the full number, all the debts together. He did not look surprised, which told her he'd known and had been carrying it alone. He looked, if anything, like a man who is quietly relieved that someone else has seen it, even if that relief is uncomfortable. She put the folded paper on the table and pushed it toward him. That's what I think we could try, she said. Timber sale, hay deal, chickens by spring, reduce costs here and here. She pointed to the lines she'd marked. It's not comfortable. It means everyone working harder than they already are. But I think it's possible. He read the paper. He read it twice. He was quiet for a long time. You worked this out in an evening? He said. 2 evenings, she said. He looked up at her. For the first time since she'd arrived, the careful formality was not entirely there. Why, he said. Why does it matter to you? She thought about that. The honest answer was complicated. The convenient answer was that she'd be out of a job if the ranch failed. But she'd worked through something closer to the truth in those 2 evenings of arithmetic. Because there are 7 boys in this house, she said, and none of them deserve to lose their home on top of everything else. Silas was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up and was moving along the side of the house with a low sound. The lamp flickered. All right, he said finally. Let's try it. She nodded and took the paper back and added 3 more notes to the margin before she folded it again. There was a lot of work ahead, and she'd learned early that the distance between let's try it and it worked was where most plans went to die. She was not going to let that happen. She had not come to Wyoming to fail. She was not entirely sure, sitting at that table across from a man she barely knew in a house that was starting to feel less foreign, what exactly she had come for. But she thought maybe she was starting to find out. The paper she'd folded and put in her apron pocket that night became the first real document of the Rourke Ranch's survival, not because it was elegant, not because it solved everything at once, but because it was the first time anyone in that house had looked at the full truth of their situation and refused to look away from it. Silas didn't mention the conversation the next morning. He came down, poured coffee, went out before sunup. That was fine. She hadn't expected him to come down full of new energy and declarations. Men like Silas Rourke didn't process hard information out loud. They went out and worked with it somewhere private, turned it over until it had a shape they could handle, and then they acted. She'd learned to recognize that type in her father, and she knew that pushing them before they were ready only made them dig in. So she let him go and turned to the immediate problems, which were as numerous as ever. The kitchen shelves, now organized and genuinely useful, had made the daily cooking measurably faster, which gave her time to tackle the next thing on her list, the laundry situation. There was no system. There had been, once she could see the remnants of it, the hooks in the right places, the tub that had been used consistently before it developed a crack that someone had tried to repair with pine tar, and mostly failed. She found a better sealant in the back of the supply shed, a tin of something Silas probably didn't know was still there, and she fixed the tub on a Tuesday morning, while the younger boys were supposed to be doing their lessons, but were actually watching her from the doorway. "You know how to fix things?" William said. He had a way of asking questions that made them sound like accusations, though they never were. "I know how to figure out what's broken and try something," she said. "That's not the same thing as knowing how to fix things. But it works often enough." He thought about that. "Caleb fixes things," he said. "He fixed the barn door hinge." "He did a good job on it," she said, because she'd looked at the hinge and it was in fact a good repair. "Your brother's capable. He's also—" William stopped. "Also what?" He looked at the floor. "He's not easy to be around lately," he said, which was such a careful, diplomatic phrasing for a boy of 11 that she almost smiled. "He wasn't always like this before." "Before your mother died," she said. Not a question. William nodded. She finished with the tub sealant and set it aside to cure. "He's been trying to hold everything together for a long time," she said. "That changes a person." Not always in good ways, she looked at William. "He loves you and your brothers. That part hasn't changed." "I know," William said quietly, in a way that suggested he did know, and that it was both a comfort and a complicated thing. She thought about that conversation, later thought about Caleb specifically, about the particular way he occupied the house. He was 19, which was old enough that the outside world treated him as a man, and young enough that he was still a boy in all the ways that mattered internally. He had taken over the management of his brothers after their mother died, filling a role nobody should have handed a teenager, and he had done it imperfectly, because he was a teenager, and imperfect was the only way it could have gone. But he'd done it. The boys were fed. The ranch hadn't collapsed. The younger ones knew they had someone they could go to. She had to stop thinking about him as an obstacle and start thinking about him as a person who was exhausted in a way he didn't know how to name. That shift in thinking changed how she approached him, not with patience performed for an audience, but with the kind of practical respect you give someone who has been doing a hard job. She stopped moving around him carefully. She started including him in decisions. The first time she did it directly, he looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language. She'd been working out the schedule for the hay surplus when to cut what remained. How to approach the neighboring rancher Silas had mentioned, a man named Garrett, who had a connection to a buyer 2 counties over. She needed to know whether the south field would yield another cutting before frost, which required someone who actually knew the land. She found Caleb in the barn doing something with a harness, and she said, "Without preamble, I need your opinion on the south field. I'm trying to work out whether we can get another cutting before the ground freezes, and I don't know the land well enough to judge." "You do." He looked up from the harness. "Why are you asking me?" "Because you know the land," she said. "You've worked it longer than anyone except your father. Your father's not here right now." Something shifted in his expression, not quite softening, but reorganizing. "The south field could give you another cutting if the weather holds," he said carefully, like he was deciding how much to give. "Maybe 3-4 weeks. If frost comes early this year, you lose the window." "What does the weather usually do in October here?" "Varies," he said. "Last year it was warm through the middle of the month. Year before that, first frost was the 24th of September. She nodded, calculating. "So we'd need to move quickly." "You'd need to move this week," he said. "If you're serious about it." "I'm serious about all of it." He looked at her for a moment. "That timber plan," he said. "Did Pa tell you how long it would take to negotiate a sale? Finding the right mill, getting someone out to assess the stand." "I know it's not fast," she said. "That's why I want the hay deal moving first. Faster income while the timber takes longer to organize." He was quiet for a moment, working the harness strap in his hands without working on the repair. "The Garrett rancher," he said. "Pa's had dealings with him before. He's fair, but he'll lowball you on the first offer. You have to come in with a number already in mind and not move off at more than 10%. She filed that away. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged like it was nothing, but she noticed he didn't go back to the harness immediately. He stood there a moment longer, turning something over, and then he said, "The chicken coop is fixable. I looked at it last spring. The frame's good, it just needs new wire and a couple of boards on the south wall." She hadn't mentioned the chickens to him. He'd been thinking about the ranch's problems on his own, the same way she had. The same way Silas had, separately, quietly, without talking to anyone else about it. This family, she thought, had been living inside their own heads for 2 years, each of them holding pieces of the same problem, never putting the pieces together because putting them together required talking, and talking required something they'd all run out of. "How much wire would we need?" she said. And just like that, they were planning together. It wasn't a transformation. It wasn't a scene where things suddenly became easy and warm. The next morning, Caleb was back to being closed and careful, and she was back to navigating around his moods with the same practical attention she gave to everything else that required management. But the conversation had happened, and the chicken coop assessment had happened, and those things didn't unhappen. 3 days after that, she approached Silas with the hay timeline and told him they needed to move within the week. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "Caleb mentioned you'd talked to him about the south field. I needed his read on the land," she said. "He said you knew what you were doing." Silas said it like he was reporting information rather than offering a compliment, but she understood it for what it was. "I'll ride over to Garrett's this afternoon. Come in with a number already fixed," she said. "Don't let him move you more than 10% off it." Silas looked at her. "That's what I always do." "Good," she said. "Then you'll be fine." She saw the corner of his mouth move, just slightly, in what might have been amusement, and then he went to get his horse. The weather held. The cutting went forward. James, who was 16 and had the kind of methodical work ethic that didn't require supervising once pointed in a direction, organized the actual labor with a couple of the older boys while Silas was at Garrett's ranch. Mara kept the younger ones occupied and out from underfoot, which was its own full-time work with Thomas and Daniel, who had discovered that fences were more interesting to climb than to repair and needed redirection approximately every 20 minutes. That evening, Silas came back from Garrett's with a deal. Not the full number she'd wanted, but within range close enough that the hay sale, added to the regular cattle income, bought them some margin on the March note. Not safety, margin, which was what they needed right now. She wrote the number into the account book, in a different column from Silas's entries. Her handwriting and his looked nothing alike, and felt the particular satisfaction of a single piece of a hard problem clicking into place. Noah watched her write from his usual corner. "Is it enough?" he said. She looked up at him, surprised as always by how much he absorbed. "It helps," she said. "It's not enough by itself, but it helps. What else do we need?" "Several more things," she said. "But we're working on them." He nodded seriously. Then he went back to his schoolwork. She'd given him a reading passage to work through, simple enough to build confidence, but real enough that he wasn't bored by it. He bent over the slate with his tongue pressed against the back of his teeth, the way he always did when he was concentrating, and she watched him for a moment and thought about the gap between what this boy was and what he could be with a few years of proper attention. That thought led to another she'd been resisting, because it was the kind of thought that made staying complicated. She was starting to care about what happened to these boys, not as a professional responsibility, as something closer than that. It was inconvenient, and she recognized it for what it was, which made it only slightly less inconvenient. The days organized themselves around the work. She woke early, managed the kitchen, oversaw the morning routine that the boys had actually begun to follow without being reminded, mostly, with some ongoing negotiation with the twins about what constituted being dressed enough to come to breakfast. She found herself knowing their patterns, which ones were slow to wake, which ones were fine until mid-afternoon, and then hit a wall, which ones needed to eat something within 30 minutes of waking or became difficult to be around. Henry, she noticed, had started talking more. Not much, he was a quiet child by nature, but more. He had taken to appearing at her elbow when she was working in the kitchen and asking questions about what she was doing. Small and specific questions that told her he was genuinely curious rather than just filling silence. She answered all of them. She showed him things when she could, how to tell when bread dough had proofed long enough, how to test whether lard was hot enough without burning yourself, how to pull a sliver without making it worse. He received all this information with a gravity that made him seem 40 years old, which was so at odds with his 9-year-old face that it was sometimes hard not to be moved by it. Eli, 13, remained the most opaque of the younger boys. He had his father's habit of processing things privately, and he moved through the household like someone who had decided the best way to avoid getting hurt again was to make himself unremarkable. She didn't push him. She simply made sure he knew, through small, consistent actions rather than words, that she saw him even when he was trying not to be seen. One afternoon, she found him sitting on the back step, with a broken slingshot and a look on his face that suggested it had been broken by someone else, and he was deciding what to do about it. She sat down beside him without asking. "Thomas or Daniel?" she said. He looked her sideways. "Thomas." He said it was an accident. Was it? Eli thought about it seriously. "Probably," he said. "But it's still broken. Can it be fixed?" He turned it over in his hands. "Maybe. The fork's bent, but it's not cracked." "There might be something in the supply shed," she said. "I saw some wire bending tools when I was looking for the tub sealant. You're welcome to look." He stood up without saying anything, but he went to look, and 20 minutes later she could hear the sound of someone working in the supply shed, and when she went to call them for supper, Eli was walking back to the house with the slingshot repaired, and his face arranged into careful neutrality that didn't quite cover the satisfaction underneath. She didn't make a thing of it. She just called him in for supper. The real test came in the 3rd week, on a day when everything went wrong in the way that happens on working ranches, not dramatically, just exhaustingly, in a series of small failures that stacked on top of each other until the weight of them was significant. The kitchen stoves flew, partially blocked, and filled the kitchen with smoke before she caught it. Thomas took a fall off a fence rail and came in crying with a scraped arm that looked bad until she cleaned it, and it turned out to be shallow. The water in the house pump came up with a funny smell for 2 hours, then cleared on its own, but for those 2 hours she'd been calculating how long the household could function on stored water. Silas came in from the north pasture with news that one of the fence lines had come down in the night, and they'd lost track of 4 cattle, all of which were eventually found, but not until after 3 hours of searching. By late afternoon, everyone in the house was tired and irritable in the specific way of people who have had a day that required too much for too little result. Supper was quiet and strained. James knocked something over and apologized too many times. Caleb ate with his jaw set. Even Noah, who was usually steady, was short-tempered with Thomas over something small that she couldn't quite hear from across the table. After supper, when she was cleaning up, Silas came and stood in the kitchen doorway, in a way that meant he wanted to say something, but hadn't found it yet. She kept washing and waited. "I know today was," he started. "It was a hard day," she said. "They happen on ranches. They happen everywhere. You didn't sign up for." "I signed up to manage a working household," she said, without turning around. "Hard days are part of that. I'm not surprised by it." There was a pause. "The other women," he said, carefully, "they left after days like this." She turned around and looked at him. He looked tired. More than tired, he looked like someone who had been waiting for a specific outcome for long enough that the waiting had become its own kind of exhaustion. "I'm not them," she said, "and I'd appreciate it if you'd stop waiting for me to behave like them." He was quiet for a moment, then fair enough. He left the kitchen. She turned back to the washing. But the conversation sat with her, because it revealed something she'd been sensing and hadn't fully named. Silas Rourke was waiting for her to leave. Not hoping she would, she was fairly certain of that by now, but braced for it, the way you brace for a thing that has already happened twice and so seems to be what things do. He had invited her into his house and made what arrangements he'd known how to make, and now he was holding his breath, waiting to see whether this was going to be one more thing that didn't work. She thought, "That is a terrible way to live," she thought, "but I understand it completely." She had been doing the same thing in her own way, with her own variety of it, waiting for the next shoe to fall, the next thing to break, the next proof that she'd misjudged the situation. They were both treating this arrangement like something fragile that would prove its fragility soon enough, which meant neither of them was quite giving it their full weight. She resolved without drama or declaration to stop doing that. She also, and this was the thing that mattered more immediately, resolved to get the chicken coop moving before the weather made it impossible. She talked to Caleb the next morning, not asking permission, presenting a plan and asking for his specific knowledge. "The frame's sound," he said for the second time, but differently this time, less like he was deciding whether to share, and more like he was working the problem alongside her. "We'd need to pull those 2 boards on the south wall. Replace the wire along the top, maybe 12 feet of it. New latch on the door." "How long?" she said. He did the math in his head. "Day's work. Maybe a day and a half. Me, James, and Eli could handle most of it." "What about William?" Caleb's expression shifted slightly, the kind of shift that contained a long history she wasn't privy to. "William tries hard," he said, which was not exactly a ringing endorsement. "William tries hard and he learns fast," she said, "and he'd be glad to be included." Caleb looked out toward the coop. "Fine," he said. "William can come." It took a day and 3/4, not a day and a half, because 2 of the boards on the south wall turned out to be worse than they'd looked and needed full replacement rather than repair, and because William dropped the wire roll once and it took 20 minutes to untangle. But by the second afternoon, the coop was structurally sound, latched properly and ready. She watched the 4 boys walk back to the house together, Caleb with the tools, James carrying the leftover wire. Eli and William trailing, William talking animatedly about something she couldn't hear, and Caleb, from the back, listening, actually listening, not tolerating. She watched that and felt something in her chest that she couldn't immediately classify, because it was made of several things: satisfaction, and something that might have been hope, and something else she wasn't quite ready to look at directly. She went inside and started supper. Noah found her 20 minutes later at the stove. He stood in his usual spot and watched her work and then said, out of nowhere, "Do you think the chickens will come next week?" "If I can arrange it with someone who has a laying flock to spare," she said. "I've got a lead through Garrett's wife. Mama used to collect the eggs every morning," he said. "She let me come with her sometimes." She kept stirring. "Did you like doing that?" "I liked being up early," he said. "Before everyone else, it was quiet." "I get up before everyone else," she said. "When we have chickens, you can come with me." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, you won't be gone before then?" The question landed with more weight than he probably intended it to carry. She stopped stirring and turned to look at him, this small, serious-faced boy who had been watching her for 3 weeks now, cataloging her actions the way you catalog things that might disappear. "No," she said, "I won't be gone before then." He nodded exactly once and went back to his spot at the corner of the table and picked up his slate and went back to his letters, as if it had been a simple question and received a simple answer. But it hadn't been simple, and she knew it, and she thought he probably knew it too. She turned back to the stove and thought about the March note, about the timber sale that hadn't been fully negotiated yet, about the seed order she needed to put together for spring so she could plan the garden, not the dead one outside. That was a separate and more complicated territory, but a productive kitchen garden that would reduce the household food costs by a meaningful amount. She thought about all the things still unfinished and uncertain, all the ways this could still go wrong despite her best efforts and the best efforts of everyone in this house. She thought about Noah asking if she'd be gone. She thought, "I told him no, so that's what's true." The weeks had a way of filling themselves. The rhythm of the ranch was beginning to feel less foreign. She knew now where the sounds came from, which creaks in the floor were structural and which were just the house settling in the cold, which direction the wind usually came from, what the sky looked like before a weather change. She was building a map of the place in the particular way you build a map of somewhere you intend to stay, not as a visitor making notes, but as a person learning a language you plan to keep using. Caleb caught her one morning looking at the north pasture from the fence line, the same way she'd done on her second day. He stopped beside her without saying anything and looked at the timber stand she was looking at. "Decent stand," he said after a moment. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about which mill to approach. Your father mentioned the one in Faro, 2 counties over." "Faro Mill is fair," Caleb said. "Slower to pay than the one in Caldwell, but the Caldwell Mill's owned by Voss." She looked at him. "Rosalie Voss's father." "Her father's company," Caleb said. "Edmund Voss. He'll underpay anyone he thinks doesn't have leverage, and he'll find a reason to delay payment until after whatever deadline you're working against." He said this without particular emotion, just information. But there was something underneath it, a history there, that she didn't have the details of, but could feel the outline of. "Faro Mill it is," she said. "You'd have to go yourself," he said. "Pa can't leave the ranch for 2 days, not right now. And they won't take a letter for the first meeting. They like to see who they're dealing with." She considered this. 2 days out and back probably, plus the meeting itself. She'd need to prepare carefully, know the figures, know the value of the timber accurately before she sat down with anyone. "I'll need someone who knows the stand well enough to give me accurate numbers," she said. He looked at the pasture for a moment. "I can walk it with you this week," he said. "Give you the count." "Good," she said. They stood at the fence line for another minute, in a silence that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable. Somewhere in between the silence of 2 people who are still figuring out what the other is made of, but who have stopped expecting the worst. Then she went back inside, and he went back to the barn, and the morning went on. In the second week of October, 2 things happened almost simultaneously that shifted the shape of everything. The first was the arrival of 6 laying hens, purchased through Garrett's wife's contact for a price that was reasonable enough to feel like a minor victory. The twins named them immediately and specifically, which was going to be a problem when any of the hens stopped laying, but she decided that was a future problem and let it stand. Noah was up before dawn the next morning, exactly as he'd said he would be. She found him already at the back door with his coat on, waiting without having made any noise so as not to wake anyone. She took him to collect the first eggs. There were 4. He held them like they were something breakable and remarkable, which they were, in their own small way, proof that the plan was working. One step of it, one morning. The second thing that happened was a letter from the Faro Mill. She hadn't written to them yet. That meant someone else had, which meant the letter was from Edmund Voss. She read it twice, standing in the kitchen with the letter in one hand, and then she set it on the table and sat down with it, and read it a third time. Edmund Voss had apparently been watching the Rourke Ranch's difficulties from Caldwell with the patience of a man who knew how to wait. The letter was politely written, formally structured, and offered to purchase the North Pasture timber at a price that was approximately 60% of what it was worth. He also noted, in the way men like Voss always noted things, that the offer was time-limited and that he was aware of the Rourke family's upcoming financial obligations. He knew about the March note. She set the letter down on the kitchen table and sat with that for a moment. Then she picked up her pencil and began calculating the actual value of the timber against the Voss offer, against the Faro alternative, against the timeline for each option, and the implications of each path. She wrote quickly, her numbers tight and small in the margin of the letter itself, using the space between Voss's careful lines. When Silas came in, she handed it to him. He read it. His face did not change, but his hands tightened on the paper slightly, which was its own kind of change. He knows about the note, Silas said. He does, she said, which means he's planning to use the timing against you. Silas put the letter down. He's offered this before, she said. Not the timber. The whole North Quarter. 3 years ago when Margaret was sick. I said no. She looked at him. He's been at this for 3 years? Edmund Voss doesn't stop, Silas said flatly. He just waits. She thought about Rosalie on the street, about the easy cruelty of her performance. The apple didn't fall far. And we don't give him a reason to think waiting worked, she said. We go to Faro. Before he has a chance to think, we're considering his offer. Silas looked at her across the table. You'd do that? Make the trip yourself? I said I would, she said. And Caleb can walk the North Pasture with me this week and give me the figures I need. I'm not going into that meeting without knowing the numbers better than they do. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected, quietly, without looking away from the table. I don't know how you do it. Do what? Keep going at it, he said, all of it. Every day. When it's not even, he stopped. When it's not even mine, she said. He looked up at her. It's not mine, she said. Not yet. Maybe not ever, depending on how things go. But those boys are here, and the land is here, and the problem is here, and I know how to think through problems. She met his eyes. That's enough reason. He didn't say anything else. But when he left the kitchen that morning, he walked differently, not lighter, exactly, but less alone-weighted, which she thought was the best she could have hoped for. She folded Edmund Voss's letter carefully, put it in the account book for evidence, and started planning the trip to Faro. She was going to need to move fast and carefully, and she was going to need to know exactly what she was worth when she sat down across from a mill operator who had no particular reason to take her seriously. She had handled that situation before. She thought about Rosalie Voss on the street in Caldwell 3 weeks ago, laughing at one bag and $41. She thought, I have considerably more than that now. Not money. Not yet. But she had 7 boys who were starting to trust her, a ranch that was slowly starting to function, a plan that was beginning to work piece by piece, and a clear-eyed understanding of exactly who was trying to buy this land for less than it was worth and why. That was more than enough to start. The trip to Faro took 2 days out and 2 days back, and Mara made it alone except for the first 12 miles, when Caleb rode alongside her on the pretense of checking the east fence line, which did not need checking and which they both knew did not need checking, but which gave him a reason to make sure she got past the stretch of road that ran through the low creek crossing without incident. He didn't say that was why he rode with her. He just pointed out the better track around the muddy section near Miller's Creek, and turned back when the road widened toward the county line. She thanked him for the fence information. He nodded and went back the way he'd come. She thought about that the rest of the first day's ride and decided it was one of the more decent things anyone had done for her in recent memory, even disguised as it was in practicality and indirection. The Faro Mills sat on the eastern edge of a small town that had organized itself around the lumber trade, the way frontier towns organized themselves around whatever single thing they had in abundance. The mill operator was a man named Aldous Crane, 60-something, with sawdust permanently embedded in the lines of his hands, and a way of looking at a person that suggested he was assessing board feet rather than social niceties. She liked him immediately. She went in with Caleb's count of the North Pasture timber, which she had checked twice herself during the walkthrough, and with the number she'd calculated as fair market, not optimistic, not inflated, the real number based on current lumber prices she'd researched through the Caldwell newspaper's commodity listings. She also went in with Edmund Voss's letter folded in her coat pocket, not to show Crane, but to remind herself of what was at stake if she came out with the wrong number. Crane offered her 80% of what she'd asked on the first round. That's not the number, she said pleasantly. He looked at her over his desk. She got the sense he didn't have many women sit across from him with timber assessments and counteroffers, but she also got the sense he wasn't the type to let novelty translate into dismissal. He was too pragmatic for that. "What's your number?" he said. She told him. She told him why. With specifics, the stand's density, the timber type, the current market. She did not tell him about the March note or the Voss letter or the ranch's financial position. She presented the timber on its own merits, the way it deserved to be presented, as something worth its actual value. They went back and forth twice. She moved 8%. He moved 12. The final number was within 4% of what she'd wanted walking in, and Crane agreed to send his own assessor out within 3 weeks to confirm the stand before the contract was finalized. She shook his hand across the desk. He held her hand a beat longer than a simple handshake required and said, "You've done this before." "Not exactly this," she said, "but close enough." She rode back to the Rourke ranch with the preliminary agreement in her coat pocket next to Voss's letter, and she thought about the distance between the two documents and what it meant. Voss had offered 60 cents on the dollar and used the threat of a deadline as leverage. Crane had offered fair value and expected fair dealing in return. The difference between the two was not just money, it was the difference between a man who saw the Rourke ranch's trouble as an opportunity and a man who saw it as irrelevant to the transaction. She knew which kind of man she'd rather do business with. When she got back, Silas was in the yard. He'd seen her coming up the road and had walked out to meet her, which she noted without making anything of it. She handed him the preliminary agreement before she'd even fully dismounted. He read it standing in the yard with the light going gold and thin in the late afternoon, and she watched his face go through several things he didn't say. "This is a good number," he said finally. "It's a fair number," she said. "There's a difference." He looked up at her. "How'd you get him there?" "Knew what the timber was worth before I walked in," she said, "and didn't move off it more than I'd planned to." He folded the agreement carefully and held it. "Caleb said you knew what you were doing," he said, and she recognized it as the same phrase he'd used before Caleb's words offered secondhand, which was still the best endorsement Silas apparently knew how to give at that point. "I'll start getting the actual seeds for the spring garden this week," she said, because the timber deal was done and she was already thinking about the next thing, which was how she worked, how she'd always worked, one foot in front of the other before the satisfaction of the last step had fully registered. It was a useful quality. It was also, she suspected, why she'd never quite learned how to rest. Inside the house smelled like the beef stew William had apparently attempted to make in her absence, under the supervision of James, who had the technical skills for it but not, it turned out, the experience to know that you couldn't leave the fire running that high for an hour without consequences. The stew was edible. The bottom of the pot was not. William met her at the kitchen door with the expression of someone bracing for judgment. "It's a little scorched on the bottom," he said. "Don't stir from the bottom," she said. "When you're simmering, you keep the heat low and you don't scrape up whatever settles. That way the taste doesn't get through the whole pot." He absorbed this. "We should have started lower." "Yes," she said. "But you fed everyone, and that's the point." His face reorganized into something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite pride, but was somewhere between the two. And she thought, this is the one who will be cooking for himself and other people inside of 5 years, if someone keeps teaching him. The thought had a satisfying quality she wasn't going to examine too closely. The third week of October came with a cold that had teeth in it, the kind of early cold that reminded you that Wyoming did not negotiate with the calendar. She accelerated the plan accordingly. More preserved food put up, more firewood moved to where it could be reached easily. The household settled into the harder rhythms of a ranch going into winter. And then, at the worst possible moment for timing and the best possible moment for revelation, came the county harvest gathering. She'd known about it for 2 weeks. It was the kind of event that was social on the surface and economic and political underneath, families from across Burnt Creek County bringing food, trading goods, establishing and reestablishing the social hierarchies that governed a year's worth of dealings. She understood these events. She'd grown up around them in a different form. They were not about harvest, they were about being seen and being judged and managing, with great care, both processes simultaneously. Silas had told her carefully that attendance was expected. "People will want to know who you are," he said, which was the diplomatic version of, "People have already decided who you are, and this is your opportunity to show them they're wrong, though some of them won't adjust regardless." She spent 2 days on the food she'd bring. Not out of anxiety, she was past letting anxiety make her decisions, but because she understood that in certain arenas, what you bring to the table is the argument. She made bread that required technique, because technique was not nothing, and anyone who knew baking would see it. She put up 3 varieties of preserves from the stores she'd found and the late-season fruit she'd arranged to get through Garrett's wife. She made an apple pie from the windfalls she'd collected from the 2 trees at the back of the property that nobody had touched since the previous fall. The apples imperfect and irregular and exactly right for a pie that had some character to it. The morning of the gathering, she was up at 4. The twins found her in the kitchen at 5 and tried to negotiate early access to the pie. She redirected them with enough authority that they retreated, but she noticed they didn't go far, which was its own form of progress. They were testing her limits now instead of ignoring her existence, which was, in its own backwards way, a sign that she'd become real to them. Silas brought the wagon around. All 7 boys were going, which was unusual enough that she gathered. It hadn't happened much recently. They'd been to events like this with Caleb managing them alone, or not at all. Having her there changed the arithmetic enough that it was possible. She rode in the wagon with the food packed carefully in the back, and the twins on either side of her, which was a logistical choice she made early to prevent them from moving around during the ride and disturbing the pie. Silas drove. Caleb rode alongside on horseback. James and the middle boys arranged themselves in the wagon bed. Noah sat near her. He was quiet the whole ride, which was his way, but she noticed he'd combed his hair, which he didn't always bother with on ordinary days. The gathering was held in the wide flat area behind the Caldwell livery, big enough for 30 families and all their wagons, and on this particular Saturday in October, close to that capacity. She could see the tables already laid out, the clusters of people, the particular social geography of a small community at leisure. She could also see from across the gathering ground Rosalie Voss. Rosalie was dressed as she always was, deliberately, expensively, in a way that was designed to establish distance before a word was spoken. She was standing with 3 other women of similar station, and she was already watching when the Rourke wagon came in the specific way of someone who has been watching for a particular thing. Mara noticed and chose not to react. She helped the boys down from the wagon, organized the food for the table, and got on with the business of the morning. For the first 2 hours, it was manageable. She met people the Garretts properly this time, Mrs. Garrett being a round-faced woman with a sharp sense of humor that came out sideways in everything she said, which Mara liked immediately. She met the Colby family, who had a daughter about William's age that William spent 20 minutes trying not to obviously look at. She met the county doctor, who was younger than she'd expected, and who asked her 3 questions about the ranch that were so specific and knowledgeable that she understood immediately he'd been following the Rourke family's situation with professional interest. The food table filled as families arrived and added their contributions. She put her bread and preserves out without ceremony, and the apple pie in the center, because it was the right size and shape for the center. She was talking to Mrs. Garrett about the chicken coop when she became aware that the conversation around her had shifted a particular kind of shift, the kind where the volume doesn't change but the attention does, the way a room's air changes when something is about to happen. Rosalie Voss arrived at the food table. She arrived the way she did everything, with full awareness of where all the eyes were and what they were doing, and with the particular confidence of someone who had never had reason to doubt that her arrivals mattered. She looked at the table. She looked at Mara's bread, the preserves, the pie. She looked at Mara. Well, she said, at a volume intended to carry to the half-dozen people nearest them. I suppose when you haven't got much else to offer, you do fall back on cooking. The women with her produced the appropriate small sounds of appreciation. A few people nearby had gone quiet in the way of people who don't want to be involved but aren't going to leave. Mara looked at Rosalie. She held the look for a steady 2 seconds. Then she turned back to Mrs. Garrett and said, You were telling me about the preserving method you use for the late plums. Mrs. Garrett, who was a woman of considerable social experience, understood exactly what Mara was doing and matched it without a beat. Yes, the key is the sugar ratio in October, because the plums are already sweeter. Rosalie had not expected to be continued past. She recalibrated. I'm only saying, she said louder now, that it's admirable, really, that someone in your position would go to so much trouble. Most women who come the way you can— How did I come? Mara said. She said it pleasantly, still looking at Mrs. Garrett as if the question were idle. By advertisement, Rosalie said. The word carried exactly the weight she intended it to carry, a particular kind of disdain that was designed to perform hierarchy for an audience. Mara picked up a knife to cut the bread into portions for the table, and still did not look at Rosalie. That's right, she said. An advertisement placed by Silas Rourke for someone to manage his household. I answered it because I was qualified and he needed help. She set 2 slices on a plate. Not particularly dramatic. 7 boys, Rosalie said, addressing the air between herself and her companions now, making it a shared observation rather than a direct attack. Can you imagine? Most women wouldn't last a week. 2 already didn't, said one of the women with her helpfully, and Rosalie smiled as if the comment were her own. I'm still there, Mara said simply. For now, Rosalie said. Though I suppose when the bank takes the property in March. The March note is being addressed, Mara said, and this time she did look at Rosalie, directly, without heat but with an absolute steadiness that was its own kind of pressure. The ranch is going to be fine. Rosalie's chin came up slightly. My father's offer was very generous. Your father's offer was 60 cents on the dollar for timber worth considerably more, Mara said, still in the same conversational register, which is not generosity. It's arithmetic. The air around them went very still. Rosalie's expression went through 2 or 3 things quickly. What settled on her face was the particular look of someone who has been accustomed to a certain type of interaction where the other party either yields or escalates emotionally, and who has encountered, unexpectedly, a third option. She didn't know what to do with Mara's specific variety of unmovable calm. It wasn't aggression, which she could work with. It wasn't submission, which she preferred. It was something else that didn't fit her categories. She looked at the pie. That's an interesting pie, she said, changing direction with the grace of someone who has learned to retreat without appearing to retreat. Rustic. It's made from the apples off the property, Mara said. Windfall fruit. Most people throw it away. I prefer to use what's there. Someone at the table she didn't catch, who made a sound that was not quite a laugh but contained one. Rosalie took a breath, recalibrated again, and was preparing something else when Silas appeared at Mara's side. She hadn't seen him coming. He moved quietly for a large man, and she suspected he had heard the exchange from further away than she'd realized. He stood beside her and addressed the gathering generally, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who was usually quiet and so was listened to when he spoke. I wanted to say something, since I'm hearing some of the conversation. Rosalie blinked. Mara came to the Rourke ranch because I asked her to, he said. I put that advertisement in the paper because my household needed managing, and I wasn't capable of doing it alone alongside the ranch work. He was not angry. He was simply clear, in the way that clarity is sometimes more effective than anger. In 3 weeks, she reorganized the kitchen, established order for 7 boys who hadn't had it in 2 years, found food stores we didn't know we had, and started working on the financial problems the ranch has been carrying. He paused. She also makes a better apple pie than anyone at this table, and I say that knowing at least 4 women here who know what they're doing in a kitchen. Mrs. Garrett said, He's not wrong about the pie, and picked up a slice, and the small movement of that, someone simply eating the pie, as if the whole previous 5 minutes were beside the point, shifted the air considerably. Rosalie Voss stood for a moment that was 2 seconds too long. Then she said, I didn't mean any offense, which was the kind of statement that meant the opposite of itself, and moved away with her companions. Silas looked at Mara. You didn't need me to do that, he said quietly, not a question. No, she said, but I appreciated it. He nodded once and went back to where the men had gathered near the wagon circle, and she turned back to the table and cut more bread, because the bread was what was needed and the moment was what it was. But she thought about what he'd said 3 weeks and how he'd listed the things she'd done, not as praise exactly, but as fact, the same way she'd have presented them herself. He'd seen it. He'd tracked it the way she'd been tracking the account book, quietly and without announcement. She hadn't known that. She filed it away and got on with the afternoon. The food was well received in the honest, practical way of gatherings, where people are genuinely hungry and cold and ready to eat. The pie was gone within 40 minutes, which was the kind of feedback that didn't require words. Mrs. Colby asked her about the preserves, and she gave the method without holding anything back, because knowledge given freely cost nothing and built more than knowledge held. The boys moved through the gathering in their various orbits. William was elaborately casual in the vicinity of the Colby girl. Thomas and Daniel terrorized the dry goods display until Eli intercepted them with the focused determination of someone who had been assigned the task by Caleb, who was talking to a group of young men near the horses and for the first time in several hours looked like something other than the weight-bearing wall of the Rourke household. He looked 19. He laughed at something one of the other young men said. She watched that and thought, he needed this. He needed to be 19 somewhere. James stayed close to the food table for most of the gathering, eating with the systematic dedication of a teenage boy who processes social anxiety by finding something concrete to do. Henry stood at the edge of groups without quite joining them, which was precisely his way. Noah stayed within sight of Mara, but didn't cling. He circled, kept track, checked in, and moved away. She understood the pattern by now. He wasn't anxious. He was monitoring. He was 8 years old, and he had appointed himself responsible for knowing where the important things were, and she had apparently become one of the important things. She thought about that and had a feeling in her chest she couldn't do anything useful with in the middle of a county gathering. So she set it aside. The afternoon was going peacefully enough that she'd almost stopped watching Rosalie when the second round came. She should have known better. A woman like Rosalie Voss didn't retreat, she regrouped. And the second round was worse than the first, because it was not delivered to Mara's face but to the cluster of women behind her, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry. I heard she couldn't even keep a position in her last town, Rosalie said, to whichever companions were still running with her. Something about a failed business. Deb's left behind. A small pause. I'm only saying what I've heard. Mara heard it. She was quite certain Rosalie knew she heard it. She also heard, very distinctly, the sound of 2 or 3 women near her, going quiet in the specific way of people who are wondering whether the story is true. She stood with her back to that, and breathed once slowly. The business had failed. That was true. Her mother's medical debts had been real, and there had been a period 4 months, humiliating and exhausting, where she'd had to liquidate almost everything to cover what was owed. There was no crime in it. There was no dishonesty in it. But it was the kind of information that sounded damning in the abbreviated, out-of-context form that gossip always used, and Rosalie knew that. She turned around. My mother was sick for 2 years before she died, she said, addressing this directly to the cluster of women, not to Rosalie. Not loudly, just clearly. The medical costs were significant. The shop my family had operated didn't survive them. Those debts were paid. She kept her voice level. Anyone who would like the details is welcome to ask me directly. Nobody asked. Rosalie had the grace to look briefly, infinitesimally uncomfortable, which Mara suspected was as close to anything resembling conscience as the woman typically got. The thing about the direct approach was that it removed the power of the information. Gossip operated in shadows. It needed the thing to remain unspoken to maintain its shape. When you simply said the thing, out loud in ordinary language, it lost most of its effect. Not all. But most. She turned back to the table. She was aware, afterward, that several women who had heard the exchange treated her differently than they had at the start of the gathering, not warmly exactly, but with a different quality of attention. The kind you give to someone you're reconsidering. Mrs. Garrett found her near the wagons as families were beginning to pack up for the day and said, directly and without preamble, Rosalie Voss has been that way since she was 14 years old. Her father made her worse. Don't let her get inside your head. She's not inside my head, Mara said. Good, Mrs. Garrett looked at her for a moment. You'll do all right here. It was a plain statement, not a compliment. She took it as such, which was probably the only way Mrs. Garrett intended it. On the way back, with the wagon going through the early dark, and the cold coming down properly now, Silas drove, and Mara sat beside him on the bench instead of in the wagon bed with the boys, because the twins had annexed her usual spot and were asleep on each other before they'd even cleared the gathering ground. They were quiet for a good mile. Then Silas said that thing Rosalie said, about your last town. It's true, she said before he could phrase the question. Not the way she told it, but the facts underneath are real. My mother's debts, the shop failing, I should have told you before. He was quiet for a moment. You paid what was owed? Every cent, she said. It took most of what I had, but yes. Then it's not my business, he said. She looked at him in the dark. It is a little, she said. You brought me into your house based on what I told you about myself. You had a right to the full picture. You told me what you could do, he said, and you've done it. He kept his eyes on the road. That's the picture I needed. She thought about that for a while. The wagon moved through the dark, and the cold was settling in the particular way that Wyoming cold settled, not sudden but cumulative, the temperature dropping degrees at a time until the air had weight. She could hear the boys in the back, the twins asleep, the older ones talking quietly among themselves. The thing with Voss, she said eventually. He's going to come back at us. He always does, Silas said. This time it'll be about the cattle prices, she said. He'll wait until the market drops and then make another offer. If he knows about the March note, he'll time it. I know, Silas said. We need to move faster on the timber contract, she said. Crane said 3 weeks for the assessor, but I want to push it to 2 if I can reach him by letter. And I want to have the February numbers ready a month early so if Voss shows up before March, we can show we don't need his offer. Silas didn't say anything for a moment. Then, you think about this all the time. Yes, she said. Even at the gathering? Especially at the gathering, she said. That's where he showed his hand. Rosalie said something about the March note, which means Edmund Voss sent her there knowing she'd repeat it. He was watching for a reaction. She paused. I'm going to give him one. Just not the one he's expecting. She could feel Silas looking at her sideways in the dark, the way he did when she'd said something that took a moment to settle. It was not an uncomfortable feeling anymore. It had become, somewhere in the last several weeks, a familiar one. What reaction are you going to give him, he said. None, she said. That's the point. We just make the payment, on time, and he has no opening. She could hear Caleb's horse behind the wagon he'd ridden back with them, rather than staying at the gathering with the young men, which she hadn't asked him to do. He'd done it on his own. She thought about that, and thought about the distance the boy had traveled in a month, not a complete journey. Not even close, but measurable. Real. Cattle prices, she said, going back to the account book in her head. I've been looking at whether there's a way to reduce the exposure. We could sell 10 head before the drop rather than after. Take a smaller loss on price, but get the cash earlier when we have more control over how we use it. That's what I was thinking last week, Silas said, and there was something slightly surprised in his voice. The residue of a man still getting used to the idea that someone else in the house was thinking about the same problems. I know, she said. I could tell from the way you marked the South herd numbers in the book. You were running the same calculation. He said nothing for a moment. Then, you read my markings. I read everything in the account book, she said. It's the only way to see the whole picture. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. Margaret used to say I marked up books the way other men talked too much and not in any order. It was the first time he'd mentioned his wife by name in her presence. She noted it and let it settle without making anything of it. She sounds like she was practical, she said. She was, he said. Practical and stubborn, didn't yield on much. He paused. Boys got it from her, most of them, I noticed, she said. They were quiet after that, the comfortable quiet of people who have run out of things they need to say rather than things they could say, which was a different kind of quiet entirely. The ranch came into view after another 20 minutes, the lamp she'd left, burning in the kitchen window. A small orange point in the dark, and she felt, coming toward it, something she hadn't expected to feel about this particular house. Something close to the feeling of arriving somewhere, rather than just going to wherever was next. She helped get the boys in and to bed, which was a considerable operation, given that the twins were still half asleep and needed to be redirected twice from the kitchen, where they were apparently planning a late raid on the biscuit tin. She got them to their room, got their boots off, and left them to sort themselves out from there, because she had her limits. Noah was the last one up. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, looking at her with his serious face, and she was putting the leftover bread away, and she looked at him and waited. She said those things about you, he said. That Voss woman's daughter. She did, Mara said. She was wrong, he said. She was working with incomplete information, Mara said, and using it on purpose, which is worse than being wrong. But yes, she didn't have the full picture. He thought about this for a moment with his characteristic seriousness. Are you going to do something about it? I'm going to do my work, she said, same as every day. That's what does something about it. He seemed to find this satisfactory. He turned to go up to bed, and then he stopped, his back to her, and said something she wasn't expecting. I told Thomas you weren't leaving. He was scared after what that woman said. I told him you weren't. She held very still for a moment. Thank you, she said. You're right to tell him that. He went upstairs. She stood in the kitchen alone for a while after that, in the quiet of a house with 9 people in it, all of them asleep except her. She stood with the lamp turned low and the account book on the table and the preliminary timber agreement and the autumn dark outside, and she thought about Noah telling his brother with complete confidence that she wasn't leaving. She thought about the responsibility of being the thing someone is certain of when they've had reason not to be certain of much. She thought, I have to make the March payment, not for the ranch, not for the account book, for Noah who had told his brother she wasn't going anywhere, for Thomas, who had believed him, for all 7 of them, the ones who tested her, and the ones who'd already stopped, the ones who were cautious, and the ones who'd decided weeks ago that she was worth trusting and had simply been waiting for her to catch up to their conclusion. She sat down at the table. She opened the account book. She worked through the February numbers 3 different ways, looking for every possible margin, every place where something could move, every resource that wasn't yet being used. She worked until the lamp needed refilling, and when she refilled it, she kept working. Edmund Voss was not going to get this land. She had decided that on the wagon ride home, in the particular way she made decisions not dramatically, not with declaration, but with the quiet finality of someone closing a door. The next morning she was up before Noah. He found her in the kitchen already, going through seed catalogs she'd borrowed from Mrs. Garrett at the gathering next spring's garden was something she was going to have to plan now, in late October, because good planning for spring started in fall and not one day later. She had her pencil and a piece of paper, and she was cross-referencing what would grow reliably at this elevation against what the household most needed in terms of food costs. Noah put on his coat and boots and came to stand at her elbow. Chickens, he said. Chickens, she agreed, and handed him the lantern, and they went out together in the cold dark to collect the morning eggs. There were 5 that morning. He counted them into the basket with the same gravity he brought to everything, and when he had all 5, he looked at her and said, That's enough for breakfast. With some left over, she said. He nodded. Good. It was. It was a small and specific good thing, the kind that doesn't solve anything large on its own, but that is nonetheless real 5 eggs in a basket on a cold October morning, a child counting them, a plan taking shape in a kitchen that 2 months ago had held nothing but old grease and disorder. She went back inside and started the fire, and the day began the way every day began now, with work to do, problems to solve, and a household that was, piece by piece, learning to stand on its own weight. The cattle prices dropped the following week. The county paper confirmed what she'd been anticipating, a 17% decline, worse than the midpoint of the range she'd planned around, and better than the worst case. She put the paper on the table next to the account book and ran the revised numbers. With hay sale already done, with the timber contract moving toward finalization, with the reduced household expenses she'd sustained, over 2 months the gap was there, but it was smaller than it would have been. Not comfortable, not safe, but workable if nothing else went wrong. That same afternoon, a rider came to the ranch with a letter from Edmund Voss. The letter was polite, formally written, and made a second offer for the North Pasture timber, at a price that was, this time, 80% of market higher than before, but still not fair, and delivered, she noticed, within 48 hours of the county paper's reporting of the cattle price drop. He was watching the ranch's situation in real time. He had sources in Caldwell who told him things. She read the letter twice and handed it to Silas. He read it and said nothing. He moved his offer up, she said, because he knows we're under pressure and he wants us to think he's being generous. Is it enough to change anything? Silas said, and she heard in his voice the particular tiredness of a man who has been fighting for a long time and is trying to assess honestly whether a different path is better. She looked at him. No, she said, we're close enough that we don't need to take 80 cents. We're not close enough that the choice is comfortable, but it's not the only path. She put her hand on the account book. Give me a week, she said. I want to run everything one more time with the revised cattle numbers. If after that the March payment genuinely looks impossible, I'll tell you and we'll talk about what Voss is actually offering. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. She picked up her pencil and went back to the numbers, and this time she didn't let herself stop until she'd found every margin there was to find. She gave herself the week she'd asked for, and she used every hour of it. The revised numbers after the cattle price drop were worse than she'd wanted and better than she'd feared, which was exactly the kind of middle ground that required the most careful navigation, too close to call without real work, too far from impossible to justify giving up. She ran the figures every night after the boys were in bed, in the quiet of the kitchen, with the lamp turned low, cross-referencing the hay sale income against the supply company debt in Cheyenne, the timber contract timeline against the banknote due date, the reduced household costs against what she still needed to buy for the winter. Silas left her to it. He understood, she thought, that she was doing the thing she'd said she would do, and that asking about the progress every day would not make the progress faster. He went out in the mornings and worked the ranch and came back in the evenings and ate and was quiet, and she respected his restraint even on the nights when she could see, from the way he looked at the account book on the table, that he wanted to ask. On the 5th day she found the margin. It was not elegant. It was not a single solution, but a combination of 6 smaller ones, each of which gave back a piece of what the cattle price drop had taken. She sold 10 head early, as she and Silas had discussed on the wagon ride back from the gathering, less per head than they'd have gotten at peak, but cash in hand now, which was worth more than a better price in February, when the note was due in March. She wrote to Crane at the Faro mill and asked whether a partial early payment against the timber contract was possible, explaining the timeline without explaining the full financial picture, and Crane wrote back within a week saying yes, 30% upfront on signing, which she had not expected and which changed the calculation considerably. She also found, going through the supply records more carefully than Silas had, that the Cheyenne Supply Company owed the ranch a credit from an overpayment 18 months ago, not large, but real, documented, and apparently forgotten by everyone except the company's own ledger. She wrote to them. They confirmed it. The credit reduced the supply debt by 11%. 11% of a debt that had been part of the impossible calculation was not nothing. She sat at the table on the 5th night with the revised total in front of her and looked at it for a long time. Then she added it up a 4th time to make sure she hadn't made an error she wanted to find, rather than an error that was there. She hadn't. The March payment was makeable. Not comfortable. Makeable. She closed the account book and put her pencil down and sat in the quiet kitchen with the sound of the Wyoming night outside and let herself feel, for approximately 2 minutes, the particular relief of a problem that has been reduced from impossible to merely very difficult. Then she picked up the pencil again and started planning what came after March. because making one payment was not the same as solving the underlying situation, and she was not going to let the relief of one thing make her slow on the next. She told Silas in the morning. She put the account book on the table and showed him the columns and walked him through each of the 6 pieces: the early cattle sale, Crane's partial advance, the Cheyenne credit, the 3 smaller adjustments she'd made to the household budget that she hadn't mentioned to him because they were in her operational area, and she hadn't wanted to flag them until she knew whether they were enough. He followed all of it. He read the numbers himself, tracing the columns with one finger the way he did when he was working through something carefully. When he got to the total, he was quiet for a long time. The supply company credit, he said. I didn't know about that. It was in the records from 18 months ago, she said. It would have been easy to miss. He looked up at her. I missed it. Yes, she said, because he'd asked and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But it's there now. He closed the account book and sat with his hands flat on the cover for a moment. We're going to make it, he said. Not a question, but testing the sound of it. We're going to make it, she said. It'll be tight through February. If anything major breaks on the property between now and March, we'll have to make different choices. But if nothing catastrophic happens, yes. He nodded. He looked out the kitchen window at the yard, at the bare trees and the cold sky, and the fence line where the cattle moved in the early light. Voss is not going to like it, he said. No, she said. He won't. Something moved in his face that she recognized now as his version of satisfaction, quiet, almost invisible, contained in the set of his jaw rather than any more obvious expression. She had learned his face the way you learn a language you hear every day without being formally taught by repetition and context, until the meaning became accessible. I'll write to his office, he said. Decline the offer formally. Use plain language, she said. Don't explain why. Just decline. He almost smiled. You think explaining gives him information? I think explaining suggests we thought about it hard enough that we feel we owe him a reason, she said. We don't. He wrote the letter that afternoon. She saw it on the table before he sealed it, and she read it because he'd left it where she could, and she understood that to mean he didn't mind. It was 5 sentences, plain and complete and utterly without explanation. It was exactly right. She didn't tell him it was exactly right. She just put it back where she'd found it and went about her work. The timber assessor from Faro arrived on a Tuesday in late October, a quiet man with a measuring compass and a methodical way of moving through the north pasture that reminded her of a doctor making rounds. Caleb walked the stand with him and answered questions and brought him back to the house for coffee afterward, during which the assessor confirmed the count she and Caleb had done together 6 weeks earlier, with a variance of less than 3%. She felt Caleb register that the validation of their work, the precision of the numbers they'd developed together. He didn't say anything about it, but she saw it in how he held himself when the assessor left. The contract with Faro was signed within the week. The partial advance arrived 10 days later. She put the figure in the account book in her own column, in her handwriting, next to Silas's markings. They're 2 different hands in the same ledger, which was beginning to look like a document that 2 people were working on together, rather than something one person had been managing alone. Caleb watched her enter the number. He had taken to being present in the kitchen more often in the evenings, not always participating in what was happening there, but present, which was its own form of engagement. He was in the kitchen when she put the advance in the book, and he leaned over from where he was sitting to look at the number. That's enough to cover most of February, he said. Yes, she said. So March'd, she said. Barely, but covered. He sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and she could see something releasing in him, not dramatically, but genuinely, the way tension releases in a body that has been carrying it too long. He was 19 years old, and he had been quietly terrified about this ranch and this family for 2 years, and the number in the account book meant something specific to him that had nothing to do with accounting. Caleb, she said. He looked at her. You kept this family together, she said. While your father was finding his footing after your mother died, and while the ranch was struggling, and while 2 women came and went, and the boys needed someone consistent, that was you. I want you to know I understand that. He said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the table, and she could see him deciding how to receive this, which was a complicated decision for a 19-year-old who had been running on pride and determination for so long that acknowledgement didn't quite have a familiar shape. I didn't do it well, he said finally. You did it as well as someone your age could have, she said. That's not the same as perfect. It's not supposed to be. He was quiet again. Then I was hard on the younger ones sometimes. I know, she said. They know it too, and they also know you were there. She waited a beat. Both things can be true. He looked at her with the expression he used when she said something that required processing, not resistance. Just time. He had started doing that more often recently, processing instead of deflecting. She took it as a sign of something important, though she couldn't have named it precisely. The bookkeeping, he said. changing direction in the way he did when a subject had been met. "You said you'd show James. I'll show both of you," she said. "Next week. James is going to need to understand the full picture eventually, and you should be in that conversation." He nodded carefully, in the way that meant he'd wanted to be included and wouldn't have asked. She went back to the account book, and he went back to whatever he'd been doing, and the kitchen held the particular warmth of a room that has become the place where things are actually worked out, rather than just where meals happen. The bookkeeping lesson happened the following Tuesday evening, around the cleared kitchen table after supper. She started with the basics, how the columns were organized, what each category represented, how to read the relationship between income and obligation. James took to it the way he took to most things, with careful attention and very few questions during the lesson and better questions afterward when he'd had time to process. Caleb sat across the table and occasionally corrected her when she made assumptions about what they didn't know, which she took as a useful indicator that he was engaged rather than merely present. William materialized at the edge of the kitchen 20 minutes in and made no pretense of having any business there, which she solved by giving him the simpler figures to add up and check cross-referencing the monthly household expenses against the recorded purchases, a job that required arithmetic but not the full context of the accounts. He was accurate and fast, which pleased him enormously. By the end of the evening, James could read the basic structure of the account book. Caleb could read the whole thing, which she suspected he'd been able to do for some time and had simply not let on. Silas came in near the end and stood in the doorway watching. She looked at him, and he looked at the table, at the three of them bent over the account book, at William checking figures, at the lamp and the pencils and the whole ordinary scene of it, and he stood there for a moment in his particular way, taking the measure of a thing before deciding what to do with it. Then he came in, pulled up a chair, and said, "Show me what you showed them." So she showed him again, from the beginning, in the same clear way she'd shown the boys, without talking down to him, and without assuming he already knew the parts he might have missed. He asked 2 questions during it, both good ones, the kind that showed he understood the structure and was testing the edges. When she answered them, he nodded and went quiet in his processing way. After she finished, Noah appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt, with the expression of someone who has heard activity and come to investigate. "Why is everyone in the kitchen?" he said. "Learning bookkeeping," William said, with the authority of someone who has been doing a thing for 45 minutes and now considers himself informed. Noah looked at Mara. "Can I learn too?" "You're 8, James said. "I know my numbers," Noah said with dignity. "You can sit in," Mara said, "but stay quiet." He came in, climbed into a chair, and sat with his hands folded on the table like a board member at a meeting, which was so precisely his way that James, across the table, had to look at the ceiling to keep from laughing. She did the household section of the accounts a second time for Noah's benefit, at a level he could follow, while the others listened. It was slower, it required more explanation. But she noticed, doing it, that Silas was following the simplified version, with the same attention. He'd given the full one, and she thought, some things are clearer when you have to say them plainly for a child. Some things you understand differently when you have to find the simplest words. By the time the kitchen cleared for bed, it was later than she'd intended. The boys went up in the usual staggered way, twins first, reluctant but genuine in their tired, then the middle ones, then James, then Noah, who paused at the kitchen door on his way out and said, without turning around, "When we pay the March thing, will the ranch be safe?" "For this year," she said. "We'll have to work on the years after. But yes, for this year." He went upstairs. Silas was the last to leave. He stood at the kitchen door with the lamp he was carrying for the stairs, and he looked at her across the room. She was putting the account book back in its place on the shelf, which she always did at the end of an evening, and he said, "You didn't have to do all that, the lesson. It would have been enough just to manage it yourself." "It's not enough," she said, without making a speech out of it. "If something happened to me, or if I left, the ranch couldn't fall back into what it was before. Someone else needs to understand the full picture." He was quiet for a moment. "If you left," he said. It was not quite a question. She recognized in his tone the same thing she'd recognized weeks ago, the held breath, the waiting for a particular outcome. But it was different now, she thought. It was not the braced expectation of someone who believes the bad thing is coming. It was something closer to the careful inquiry of someone who has stopped expecting the worst and is starting tentatively to hope for something else. She didn't answer it the way he'd left it, which was sideways and uncertain. She answered it the way she answered most things, directly. "I'm not planning to leave," she said. He held the lamp and looked at her. "I know you said that to Noah," he said. "I heard you from the hall." "I said it to Noah because it was true," she said. He nodded. Once, the way he nodded when something was settled. "Good night, Mar," he said. "Good night," she said. He went upstairs with the lamp. She stood in the dark kitchen for a moment before she lit the second lamp to take to her own room. She thought about the account book on the shelf, and the March note, and the timber contract, and the chickens producing reliably now, and the winter garden she'd planned for spring. She thought about William, who could now cross-reference expense records in his head, and James, who could read a ledger, and Caleb, who could walk a timber stand and come back with numbers accurate to 3%. She thought about Silas saying goodnight, Mara, instead of goodnight, Miss Ellison, which he'd stopped saying weeks ago but which she'd only just noticed had changed. She picked up her lamp and went to bed. November came in hard that year, which was Wyoming's way of making its preferences known without ambiguity. The cold was specific and committed, not the hovering cold of October, but the settled kind that arrived and stopped apologizing for itself. She adjusted the household routines accordingly, more time indoors, which meant managing 7 boys in an enclosed space for larger portions of the day, which was its own considerable challenge. The twins, deprived of outdoor range, redirected their energy in ways that were creative if not always welcome. She found them one afternoon in the supply shed, conducting what they described as an experiment with the leftover pine tar and 3 of Caleb's tools, and she removed them from the situation with the firmness of someone who has learned that redirecting their specific variety of energy was more effective than containment. She put them in the kitchen and gave them each a task that required enough attention to keep their hands from wandering Thomas stirring, something that needed constant stirring, Daniel counting the stores she needed to record in the winter inventory. They worked with complete seriousness, which was the thing about the twins that she had come to appreciate. When given something real to do, they did it genuinely. They weren't actually trying to cause disorder. They were just very alive in a way that required a channel, or it went in whatever direction was available. Eli, 13, had started spending time with Caleb in a way that was new, following him out to the barn in the mornings, helping with the things he'd previously been too small to help with properly, being included in the actual work of the ranch rather than assigned the peripheral tasks he'd been given before. She noticed it first because Eli came to the kitchen one morning with the particular confidence of a boy who has been trusted with something real, and she thought, Caleb is doing that, deliberately. She didn't say anything to Caleb about it, but she noticed Henry 9 had become her most reliable kitchen assistant, not in an official way, not assigned, but consistent. He appeared every afternoon and helped without being asked, and she had stopped being surprised by it and started relying on it, which she recognized as the point at which something stops being a novelty and becomes part of the actual structure of things. One afternoon in the second week of November, Henry was helping her put up the last of the preserved foods from the garden's late harvest, very late, the hardiest things that had made it past the first frost, and he said, without looking up from what he was doing, "You know that garden out front? Mama's garden?" "Yes," she said. "I think she'd want someone to use it," he said. "If she knew it was just sitting there." She worked for a moment without speaking. "What makes you think that?" He considered the question with the gravity he brought to everything. "She planted things to eat," he said, "not to look at." That's what Caleb said once. He said she planted things that were useful. He set a jar carefully on the shelf. "So I think she'd want the useful part to keep going." She thought about the dead garden she'd seen on the first day, about telling Caleb she'd leave it alone until spring, about the spring seeds she'd already ordered. She thought about the particular delicacy of the territory she was in, which was not her territory, technically, and might never be, and which she had to approach with the care you give to things that belong to someone else's grief. "That's thoughtful reasoning," she said. He looked at her sideways, checking whether she meant it. She did, and her face said so. He went back to the jars. "Maybe in spring," he said. "You could grow tomatoes there." "I'd need to know what she grew before," she said, "to decide what to add and what to keep." He was quiet for a moment. "I remember some of it," he said. "She had tomatoes and beans and those yellow squash. And there was something she called her Juliet plant that had little red things all over it in the summer. Noah would know more. He used to help her." "I'll ask Noah," she said. He nodded and moved to the next shelf, and the conversation closed the way it had opened, without drama, in the ordinary rhythm of work. But it stayed with her the rest of the day because Henry had just handed her something, permission, offered in the most indirect and genuine way possible, by the child who was perhaps least likely to give it easily. She talked to Noah that evening. She sat down beside him at the corner of the table, where he always did his schoolwork, and she asked him directly what his mother had grown in the garden. He looked at her for a moment, checking her face the way he always did, before giving information that mattered to him. Then he told her. He told her in careful detail, the way he remembered everything, the arrangement of the rows, the specific varieties where he knew them, the things that had done well, and the 1 year the beans had gotten some kind of blight that his mother had talked about for the entire following winter as a reference point for future planting decisions. She listened to all of it and wrote down the parts she needed. When he was done, he looked at his slate and then back at her. "Are you going to change it all?" he said. "No," she said. "I'm going to keep what she knew worked and add what I know from different soil. Same way anyone builds on a garden that was already planted by someone who knew what they were doing." He thought about this. "That seems right," he said. "I thought it might," she said. And she went back to her planning, and he went back to his letters, and the kitchen held them both in its ordinary way. December was where everything got real. Not because anything catastrophic happened. The ranch held, the winter routines held, the boys held. But December was where the financial calendar started its final tightening. The hay sale money was accounted and allocated. The timber advance was in the ledger. The 10 heads sold early had added their portion. Every piece was in place, and the total was the total, and now it was a matter of holding the line through the last 3 months without anything breaking. She managed it the way she managed everything, one day at a time, with complete attention to what each day she actually required, rather than what she was afraid it might require. The ranch had a rhythm by December that it hadn't had in September. She could feel it. When she woke up in the mornings, the sounds were the same sounds, in the same order. The boys moved through their routines without the entropy that had characterized her first weeks. The kitchen functioned like a kitchen. None of it was perfect. Thomas still needed redirecting regularly. William still left things in the wrong place, with a consistency that suggested he genuinely didn't see them where he'd put them. James had a tendency to take on more than he could complete, and then not say so until the incompleteness became visible, which was something she was still working on. Caleb had days where the old closed quality came back, usually after something had gone wrong on the ranch that he hadn't been able to prevent, and on those days she gave him space and made sure there was food he could eat without sitting at the table with everyone if he needed to. But the pattern was there, and the pattern was what she'd come to build. Silas in December was different from the Silas she'd met in September. Not transformed, she was suspicious of transformation, which happened in stories but rarely in people, who generally changed slowly and incompletely, and not always in the direction you hoped. But he was different in the way of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long that the act of sharing the weight has changed his posture. He stood differently. He came to the table differently. He talked to the boys differently, not better in every way. Because he was still a man who processed things internally and found direct conversation with his children difficult in the specific way that men of his generation and situation found it difficult. But he tried more. She could see the trying even when it was awkward, even when Caleb's guard went up in response to something Silas said, in a way that Silas didn't quite know how to get around. She stayed out of that. It was theirs to work through, and she was not the instrument of it, only the changed condition that made working through things possible now in ways it hadn't been. 2 weeks before Christmas, which was observed on the ranch, with a quiet practicality that matched everything else about the place, Noah came to find her in the afternoon, with a serious face and a piece of paper. She recognized the paper. It was from the writing supplies she'd ordered in October for the boys' lessons. He'd written something on it, in his careful, still-developing handwriting. He held it out to her. It was a list. At the top it said in his handwriting things the ranch still needs. Below it were 6 items, each written out in full sentences, specific things he'd identified, with reasoning attached to each. The chicken coop needed a second roost bar, because 3 of the hens were competing for the same spot at night. The fence on the east side of the kitchen garden had 2 posts that were leaning. The cold box in the root cellar was losing temperature in the back corner, which he'd noticed because the leftover stew had gone off faster there than in the front. She read all 6 items. Then she looked at him. "You've been watching the ranch," she said. "I watch things," he said. "You do," she said. "This is good work, Noah." She looked at the list again. The cold box, how long have you noticed that, he thought. "About 3 weeks. You should have told me sooner," she said. "That kind of temperature loss can waste the stored food." "I know," he said. "I wasn't sure if it was important enough." "It is," she said. "Anything that affects the food stores is important. Come to me sooner next time." She folded the list. "I'm keeping this. We'll work through it." He nodded, satisfied with this outcome in his precise way. Then he said, "Am I useful?" She looked at him. He was 8 years old, and asking her a question that she understood was not simple, that had layers in it she couldn't fully map, but could feel the weight of. "Yes," she said, "you're useful. You're also more than useful, but useful is the part you were asking about, so yes." He seemed to receive this with the care he gave all information that mattered. Then he went back to wherever he'd come from, and she unfolded the list and went to look at the back corner of the root cellar. He was right about the temperature. She found the gap in the insulation in 20 minutes and packed it before supper. The cold box was restored by the following morning. January tightened everything down further. The cold was serious now, the kind that killed things that weren't properly prepared and made everything that was prepared harder. She kept the house warm with careful management of the firewood, enough in each room to keep the cold from damaging pipes or making the boys sick, not so much that they burned through the supply too fast. She cooked heavier food that stayed with people longer, because cold and physical work required more calories, and the household was doing both. She watched the flour and the lard and the preserved stores with an eye that was calibrated to the pace of consumption, keeping ahead of the point where they might run short. Nothing catastrophic happened in January, which she took as neither a sign nor a guarantee, but simply as the fact of it. January passed without catastrophe. February arrived, and she sat down with the account book and ran the final numbers. The total was there, with a margin of $63. Not comfortable, not the kind of margin she'd have wanted, but real and counted and sufficient. $63 between the Rourke ranch and the March payment, after everything she'd done and everything the family had done, after the hay and the timber and the early cattle sale and the supply credit and the 100 small adjustments she'd made to the household over 4 months. She told Silas at breakfast. She said it plainly. We have enough for March. There's a $63 margin. Nothing can break before then, but we have enough. He set down his coffee cup. The boys were at the table, some of them eating, some of them listening, without quite admitting to listening. $63, he said. $63, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected, not as a declaration, but as a simple statement, in the same plain voice he used for everything. I couldn't have done this without you. She looked at him across the table. She thought about the first morning, the dishes, the empty shelves, Caleb in the doorway, the dead garden outside. She thought about the account book with 2 sets of handwriting in it, and the chicken coop fixed by 4 brothers who hadn't worked together willingly in 2 years, and Noah's list of 6 things that needed doing. You would have found a way, she said, because she believed it. Maybe, he said, but not this way. The table was quiet. Even the twins were still. Then William said, Can we have more eggs if the chickens are doing well? And the morning resumed its ordinary shape, with Noah explaining to William that more eggs required more hens, not more wanting, and Thomas immediately proposing they get more hens, and Daniel agreeing with Thomas as he always did, and Eli telling them both to eat their breakfast, and James watching all of it with the quiet amusement of the eldest son, who has seen this particular loop play out enough times to find it more entertaining than exhausting. Caleb looked at Mara from across the table. She looked back at him. He gave her, very briefly, the smallest nod she'd ever seen, barely a movement, really, more a decision made visible for a fraction of a second. Not thanks exactly, something beyond thanks or different from it. An acknowledgement between 2 people who had spent 4 months navigating each other from a considerable distance and had arrived, without quite planning to, at something like mutual regard. She picked up her coffee and looked out the kitchen window at the February ranch, bare and cold and holding. $63 of margin and a plan that had worked, piece by piece, the way plans work when the people executing them refused to stop. The bank draft went out 2 weeks before the March due date, because she had written it early, and Silas had signed it, and she had mailed it through Orland at the general store, with a return receipt requested, because she wanted documentation in hand before Edmund Voss had any opportunity to intercept the narrative. The receipt came back on a Thursday in early March confirming payment received. She put it in the account book, flat against the inside cover, and said nothing to anyone until Silas came in that evening, at which point she handed him the account book, opened to the receipt page, and let him read it himself. He read it. He put the book down on the table. He stood for a moment in the kitchen with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set in the way it set, when he was working very hard not to show something. Then he went to the back door and called out to the yard, Caleb. And Caleb came in, and Silas showed him the receipt, and the look on Caleb's face, the unburdening of it. The specific quality of a weight that has been released from a 19-year-old body that was never built to carry it was the kind of thing she turned away from, because it was not her moment to witness, or not primarily. She went to the other side of the kitchen and started supper. But she heard Silas say quietly to his son, "We made it." And she heard Caleb say, after a pause, in a voice that was lower than usual and slightly unsteady, "Yeah, we did." And that was enough. The receipt stayed in the account book against the inside cover, and every time she opened the book in the weeks that followed, she saw it there, a plain piece of paper, with plain language on it, confirming that a debt had been paid, and she thought about how much work was contained in that unremarkable document. 6 months of calculation and negotiation, and early mornings, and cold root cellars, and 1 trip to Faro, and 7 boys learning to function as something other than 7 separate people surviving in the same house. All of it compressed into a bank's confirmation stamp and a date in early March. She did not frame it or make ceremony of it. She left it in the book where Silas had put it back, and she moved on to the next problem. Because that was how it worked. The solving of one thing was not a stopping point, but a transition. And she had learned long ago that the people who stopped at the transition were the ones who found themselves without momentum when the next difficulty arrived. Spring was the next thing. Spring was already arriving in the specific tentative way of Wyoming spring, which committed to nothing and could reverse itself inside of 48 hours. She had her seed order from Mrs. Garrett's catalogs. She had Noah's remembered inventory of his mother's garden and her own additions. She had Henry's permission, given in the indirect way of a 9-year-old who didn't know he was giving permission but was. She had not yet touched the garden. She had walked past it every day since September, through fall and into the deep cold, and she had let it stay in its dead and dormant state because it needed to be spring before it was a garden again. And because some things require the right time, even when you know what you're going to do with them. The boys had stopped visibly registering it after a while. It was just part of the yard. The way things you see every day stop requiring active noticing. But she had registered it. She had been noting, all winter, the way the dead stalks held their positions in the cold and then slowly fell over in the January wind. And she had thought about what was actually underneath not dead. Most of it, just dormant, waiting for the temperature to tell it to try again. That was the thing about gardens. They didn't require belief. They just required the right conditions and enough time. The first Saturday in April, she went out before breakfast with a spade. Noah was behind her before she'd turned the first section of soil. He hadn't been told. He'd simply gotten up and looked out the window and seen her there and put his boots on. He didn't say anything when he came out. He just stood at the edge and watched for a moment, and then he crouched down and picked up a piece of the turned soil and crumbled it between his fingers the way he'd seen someone do before, checking the texture. "It's ready," he said. "I know," she said. "I checked it yesterday." He looked at the spade she was using. Then he went to the shed and came back with the smaller one that had been in the corner, which she hadn't been sure was usable. He'd apparently checked it, because he came back with it cleaned and the handle wiped down. He started working the adjacent section without asking whether he should. They worked side by side for an hour before the household noise from inside suggested that everyone else was waking up. Henry came out first, then the twins, who required 3 minutes of supervision to prevent them from treating the turned soil as an obstacle course. James appeared at the back door with coffee for the adults, which was new she hadn't asked, and Silas hadn't sent him and stood on the step, watching the garden work with his usual quiet assessment. Caleb came out last. He stood at a distance for a long moment, longer than the others, looking at the garden that had been his mother's and was now being turned back into something living. She kept working. She didn't look at him or perform anything for his benefit. She turned the soil and let him stand there and have whatever he needed to have about it. After a while, he came over and looked at what she'd done, and he looked at the seed packets she'd laid out on the fence rail, and he picked one up and read the label. "Juliet tomatoes," he said. "Henry told me she grew them," she said, and Noah confirmed. He put the packet back on the rail carefully, in the exact position it had been. He stood there a moment longer. "The east side gets the best morning light," he said. "She always put the tomatoes there." "That's where I was planting them," she said. He picked up a spade that had been leaning against the fence and started on the east section without further comment. She let him work. She didn't make it a thing. She just worked alongside him in the garden his mother had planted, and that was going to become, in its own way, something new without losing what it had been, an addition to a history rather than a replacement of it. That was the only way she knew to do it. You didn't erase the thing that was there before. You built alongside it and let the two things coexist until they were simply the same place with a longer story. Silas came out mid-morning and stood at the edge of the garden and looked at all of it, his sons scattered across the rows, the turned soil, the seed packets on the fence rail, working the center section with her sleeves pushed up and her hair coming loose in the April wind, and he stood there for a while with his coffee. She looked up at him once. He looked back at her. There was something in his face she recognized now, something she'd been seeing for several weeks in its growing form. Something that had started as the careful formality of a man who didn't know what to make of her, and had slowly become the open, undefended look of a man who had stopped trying to categorize what he felt and had simply started feeling it. She knew what it was. She had known for a while. She had been letting it develop at its own pace, because she understood from the particular weight of her own experience that some things announced themselves before they were ready, and that announcing them too early was a way of frightening them off. But it was April now, the March note was paid, the garden was being planted. She had been in this house for 7 months, and she knew where the coffee was, and which floorboard creaked in the hall, and that Silas marked the account book in the upper right margin when he'd looked at something and wasn't sure yet what to do about it. She knew this house. She knew this family. That knowledge lived somewhere in her chest in a way she hadn't planned for and couldn't fully describe, but she had stopped pretending it wasn't there. 3 days after the garden work began, in the early evening while the boys were occupied, and the kitchen was quiet, Silas came in and sat down at the table without the account book. That was unusual enough that she noticed immediately he always had something in his hands, something that provided the appearance of purpose for sitting down. This time he sat down without anything, which meant he'd decided to say something before he'd quite figured out how to say it. She poured him coffee and sat across from him and waited. He turned the cup in his hands. He looked at the table. Then he looked at her. "I need to say something," he said, "and I'm not good at saying things. You know that by now." "I know," she said. "When I placed that advertisement," he said, "I was looking for what it said. Someone to manage the household. Someone to help with the boys." He paused. "That's what I told myself. That's what I wrote." "I know what you wrote," she said. "I answered it." "Yes," he turned the cup again. "And you came, and you did all of that. And more than that." He stopped. He started again from a different angle, which was his way when the direct path was too exposed. "The boys needed someone," he said. "I knew they did. I didn't let myself think about what I needed. That seemed like a separate question. Or not a question I had any right to be asking yet." She held the silence for him. "It's not a separate question anymore," he said. He looked at her with the directness he could manage when he'd made up his mind, and when Silas Rourke made up his mind about something, she had learned it was genuinely made. He didn't say things he hadn't meant first. "I don't want you to stay because the ranch needs managing. I don't want you to stay because the boys need someone. I want you to stay because I—" He stopped again, and she could see him choosing the word, weighing it, making sure it was the right one. "Because I love you. And I should have said it before now, and I didn't know how to say it, and I'm saying it now." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the April wind moved around the house in its particular way. She thought about a woman who had stepped off a stage 7 months ago with one bag and $41 and a plan to treat this arrangement as a transaction and nothing more. She thought about how that plan had lasted approximately 6 weeks before she'd started caring about the outcome of things that were technically not her problem. She thought about seed catalogs and account books and a small boy counting eggs in the cold dark and a 19-year-old's face when a weight came off him. She thought about what it meant to find home somewhere you hadn't expected. "I came here," she said, "because I needed work and you needed help, and neither of us had anywhere better to be." That was true. She looked at him across the table. It stopped being the whole truth somewhere around October. "I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to do with it, and because the ranch needed to survive first, and because saying it out loud before I was sure felt like a risk I wasn't ready to take." He watched her. "I'm sure now," she said. He put his hand on the table, palm up. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand placed on a table, open, waiting. She put hers in it. They sat like that in the quiet kitchen for a moment, which was not a romantic scene and was not designed to be two practical people who had found each other in a practical situation and had discovered, through the slow accumulation of hard days and honest conversation and shared problems, that something had grown up between them that deserved to be named. "I'd want to marry you properly," he said. "Not just arrangements. A real thing." "That's what I'd want too," she said. He nodded. His hand was warm and rough from the ranch work, and she thought, this is a real thing. This is what a real thing feels like. Not the version from the story where everything resolves cleanly and everyone becomes their best self. The version where two imperfect people sit at a kitchen table and decide to make something together out of what they actually are. She squeezed his hand once and let it go, because supper needed starting and Noah would be in shortly for his afternoon egg check. And life on a working ranch did not hold itself in pause for sentiment, which was fine. Sentiment didn't require pausing for. It just required acknowledging and then carrying forward into the ordinary work of things. She got up and started the fire. They told the boys the following Sunday, before the morning had fully organized itself. She and Silas had talked about how to do it, not a presentation, not a formal announcement, just a conversation at the breakfast table before anything else happened that day. She had argued for plain and early, before anyone had time to build up to a version of it in their heads. He had agreed. She let Silas say it. It was his family first, his sons, his house. She sat beside him and let him say the thing, which he did in his direct way, without preamble. They were going to get married. In April. A small thing, just themselves and the neighbors they were close to. He hoped the boys would be glad. The table was quiet for a moment. Then William said, "Does that mean she's staying?" "Yes," Silas said. William looked at Mara with a relief so obvious and unguarded that she had to look at the table for a second. Good, he said. I didn't want to have to learn to cook. James said, you'd have to cook anyway. That's not her job alone. But he was saying it with the half-smile that meant he was glad. And William knew it, and the table knew it. The twins looked at each other and had a silent conversation that lasted 2 seconds, and resolved in simultaneous nodding, which was their way. Thomas said, can we be in it? Meaning the wedding. And Daniel immediately agreed with Thomas, as they always did. Henry, who was sitting in his usual careful way, looked at Mara and said, you're going to grow the tomatoes. I already started, she said. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already known. Eli said nothing out loud, but she caught his eye across the table and he gave her a brief, private look that she understood. He was all right with it. More than all right. He just wasn't going to say so with an audience. Caleb was the last, which was how it always was with Caleb, last to speak, first to have an opinion. He had been eating through the announcement, not ignoring it, but processing it in his way. When everyone else had said their piece and the table had moved on to the ordinary business of breakfast, he looked at her. You'll be a Rourke, he said, testing the sound of it more than asking. If that's what happens, yes, she said. He chewed. He thought. He set down his fork. When you first came, he said, I thought you'd be like the others. I know you did, she said. You weren't, he said. No, she said. He picked up his fork again. Good, he said, and ate. And that was all he said. And it was the thing she had worked the hardest to earn and received in the least dramatic possible way, which was exactly right. They married on the 14th of April, which was the first Saturday where the weather cooperated enough to hold something outside. The ceremony was brief and plain. The justice of the peace from Caldwell, a handful of neighbors including Mrs. Garrett, who brought a pie that she presented to Mara with the specific energy of someone making a point, and the 7 Rourke boys in their best clothes, most of which had been let out or taken in recently to account for the growing that had happened over the winter. The twins were in it as promised. They had assigned themselves the roles of ensuring everyone stood in the right place, which they did with great seriousness and some reorganization of the proceedings that the justice of the peace took philosophically. Noah stood on her left side. He had positioned himself there without being asked, in the way he managed most of his important decisions quietly, without announcement, as if the decision had been obvious and required no explanation. She had looked down at him before the ceremony started, and he had looked up at her with his serious face, and she had thought, this is the boy who has been waiting since September to stop waiting for everything to go away. She thought, he can stop now. She had not made promises to a family. She had made a life inside one, piece by piece, the way things actually get made without a plan for exactly how they'd turn out, with a great deal of daily work and imperfect navigation, and enough stubbornness to stay when staying was hard. After the ceremony, standing in the yard with the April light coming through the bare-budded trees, Caleb came to stand beside her. He didn't make a speech. He was not a speech-making person, and she would have been suspicious of it if he had been. He said, welcome to the family, and offered his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and completely sincere, and she thought, that is the hardest acceptance she'd fought for, and he'd offered it in a handshake, which was exactly the right amount of formality for both of them. Mrs. Garrett, passing by with 2 plates, said to no one in particular, about time, and kept walking, which made James laugh genuinely, the way he didn't always let himself laugh in public. The spring moved forward the way springs do on working ranches faster than you expect, with more demands than the previous season, and never quite enough hours in the day. The garden filled in through May, row by row, the turned soil giving back what it had been keeping dormant through the long winter. Tomatoes first, because she and Noah had started them inside in early April, on the kitchen windowsills in small pots, and they were already several inches high by the time the ground was warm enough for transplanting. The Juliet variety in the east section, as Caleb had directed, where the morning light came first and longest. She worked the garden in the early mornings, before the household fully woke, in the quiet that Noah had described, the particular early morning quiet of a ranch before the day's demands arrive. She worked it not because she had to at that hour, but because the garden had become her thinking time, the way some people need motion to think clearly, and she needed her hands in soil, and her eyes on something growing. She thought about many things in that garden. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the stage in September with no particular expectation of being wanted anywhere. She thought about the particular damage that does spending enough years as someone's inconvenience, someone's too difficult, someone's not worth keeping, until you stop arguing with the assessment and simply start working around it. You become very good at being useful. You become very good at solving problems. What you lose slowly, without noticing exactly when it goes, is the expectation that any of it entitles you to something that is simply yours. She had arrived at the Rourke Ranch with $41 and a bag that was half empty, and a very clear sense of what she was offering in exchange for room and board. She had not arrived expecting to be chosen. She had not allowed herself to want that, because wanting things that haven't been offered is how you get hurt. And then a ranch full of imperfect, grieving, struggling people had chosen her anyway, not as a transaction, not as a solution to a problem, but as a person who belonged there. It had happened not in a single moment, but in accumulations, a boy drying dishes beside her, a 19-year-old sharing fence line knowledge he hadn't been asked for, a man placing his hand palm up on a kitchen table. The lesson she had taken from it, the thing she would carry forward, the thing that felt true enough to be worth passing on was this: worth is not proved by usefulness alone. She had been useful before. She had been useful in the failing shop, and useful in her mother's last years, and useful in every situation that hadn't kept her. Usefulness was not the thing that made the Rourke family choose her. What made them choose her was that she had stayed. She had stayed when it was hard and when she wasn't sure, and when Caleb was closed off, and when the numbers didn't balance, and when Rosalie Voss said something designed to make her feel like less than she was. She had stayed not because she had no other option, but because she had looked at 7 boys, and a struggling man, and a dead garden, and decided that this was worth her full effort, and then she had given it. Staying, she had learned, is its own kind of love. It is the kind that doesn't announce itself. It just shows up every morning and does the work. In June, the tomatoes had grown enough that she could see them from the kitchen window when she stood at the stove. The Juliet plants were heavy with small red fruit, the east-facing section exactly where Caleb had directed, exactly where Margaret Rourke had put them, the same variety in the same soil going into its second life. Noah collected the first ones. He brought them in to her in both hands, cupped carefully, 6 or 8 of the small red fruit, and put them on the kitchen table, with the expression of someone completing a transaction they've been working toward for a long time. She looked at them. She looked at him. "We should have them for supper," she said. "We should," he said, and went back outside. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden full now, green and specific, with the evidence of work and planning visible in every row. She could see from here exactly where she'd had the soil too dry in the early weeks, before she'd adjusted the watering, a slightly paler section in the beans that had corrected itself by May. She could see the east-facing tomatoes heavy with fruit. She could see the squash getting aggressive at the south end, which was going to be next week's management problem. She thought about the first morning she'd looked at this garden in September, when it was nothing but dead stalks and compacted earth and grief. She had thought then, dormant, not dead. She had believed that because she'd needed to believe it, and because it was true, not the wishful version of true, but the practical, biological, demonstrable kind. Some things look like endings that are not. Silas came in behind her, moving through the kitchen on his way to the back door, and stopped when he saw her at the window. He came to stand beside her and look at what she was looking at. "The squash is getting into the bean row," he said. "I know," she said, "next week." He looked at the tomatoes. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then she'd have liked knowing they were still there. "I think so too," she said. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly, the way he touched things he cared about, without performance, and then he went out the back door to whatever needed doing that afternoon. She stayed at the window a moment longer. July brought heat and the full force of a Wyoming summer, and enough work to fill every hour of every day and part of the night. The garden produced in the way gardens produce when they have been properly tended, generously, almost aggressively, in the way of living things given the right conditions. She was putting up preserves again, this time from stock she'd grown herself, which had a different quality to it than finding things that had been left behind. This was something she'd made from the ground up, planned in October, planted in April, tended through May and June, and now harvesting in July. The boys were different than the boys she'd met in September. Not different in the fundamental way of their characters. Thomas was still Thomas, which meant someone was still keeping count of the things he'd knocked over, but different in the way of people who have moved through something difficult together and come out the other side changed by the experience. Caleb had taken on a new role on the ranch, not as the boy who held things together out of necessity, but as the young man who was learning how to build things on purpose. He and Silas had started talking properly, in the way they hadn't been able to do when Caleb was 19, and holding everything alone, and Silas was absent inside his grief. It was not a smooth relationship. There were still days when old patterns reasserted themselves, and they went at cross purposes, and the tension in the house had a particular quality. But they talked through it now, imperfectly, with effort, which was more than they'd managed before. James, 17 now, had grown into something she respected, a young man who did hard work without complaint, and who was beginning to understand, from the bookkeeping lessons and from watching how the ranch operated, that managing a property was a different skill from working it, and that he wanted to develop both. He had asked her in June whether she thought he could handle the South Herd accounts on his own. She had said yes with oversight. He had done it correctly the first time and made one error the second, caught it himself and corrected it before she'd seen it. She found out about the self-correction later from the ledger, and she put a small mark beside the corrected entry and said nothing about it. William had learned to cook. Not brilliantly, he had a heavy hand with the salt, and a tendency to add things and see what happened, which produced unpredictable results, but genuinely. He could produce a meal from available ingredients without supervision, which was the standard she'd set him, and he met it. He also continued to be the boy most likely to be found exactly where the most people were, which was not a problem, but simply his nature. He needed human proximity the way some people need silence, as a baseline for functioning. Eli had grown. Physically, yes, he was taller than Caleb had been at 13 by at least an inch, but also in the way that mattered more. He had stopped making himself unremarkable. He had opinions now, expressed carefully but consistently, and he defended them when questioned, which had produced 2 significant arguments with Caleb over the summer that she had let run their course because they were the arguments of 2 people who were each more capable than they'd been when they started. The arguments had resolved. They always did. Henry remained her kitchen companion, her observer, her steady presence in the afternoon hours. He was 10 now, had grown out of the frozen terror quality she'd seen on her first evening, and had replaced it with something more like settled watchfulness. He still noticed everything. He still brought her information: a loose board in the root cellar steps, a hen who was eating less than the others. He had taken to writing his observations down, which was his own version of the list he'd shown her that November, and which she encouraged by giving him a proper notebook for Christmas. Noah was a different question from all of them. Noah in July was 9 years old, and had stopped waiting for everything to disappear. She could see it in how he moved through the house, not with the careful monitoring quality he'd had when she arrived. The way of a child who keeps checking to see that the things that are supposed to be there are still there. He moved now with the ordinary confidence of a boy who assumes the world around him will hold, which is a simple thing, and also everything. He still got up early. He still came out in the dark to collect eggs with her. On the mornings she went to the coop before the household woke. He still counted them with the same precision. But the precision had changed. It was no longer the precision of someone checking that things are still intact. It was the precision of someone who simply takes care of things, because that is what you do. One morning in late July, coming back from the coop with a full basket between them, Noah said, "Are you happy here?" She considered the question because it deserved to be considered, rather than answered reflexively. "Yes," she said, "not in the way where everything is easy, in the way where it's mine. This life is actually mine, and that's yes. That's happy." He thought about this for a moment, turning it over with the seriousness he brought to ideas worth examining. "Is it different from before?" "Very different," she said. "What was before like useful?" she said. "I was always useful. But I wasn't sure I was wanted. The way you can keep a tool and use it and never think about whether the tool would rather be somewhere else." He looked up at her as they crossed the yard back toward the house. "You're not a tool," he said, with the directness of a child for whom this was simply obvious. "No," she said, "I know that now." He seemed satisfied with this. He opened the kitchen door and went inside ahead of her, and she stood for a moment, in the July morning, at the back door of the house she now lived in, the house she had arrived at with nothing, and which had become the place where she understood herself to belong. She had thought, once, that belonging required proving yourself worthy of it. She had spent a great deal of effort proving things. What she understood now, from the other side of that effort, was that the proving had not been what made her belong. The proving was just the work. What made her belong was the staying and the choosing and being chosen in return. The garden was behind her, full and green in the morning light. The kitchen was ahead of her, with 9 eggs in a basket and a household coming awake. The account book was on its shelf with 2 sets of handwriting in it, and the bank receipt was flat against the inside cover, and the seed catalogs she'd ordered for next year's planting were already stacked on the corner of the table. She went inside. She put the eggs down, started the fire, and began the morning. By August, the tomatoes had produced so well that she was running out of jars. This was, she decided, a good problem to have. She sent William to the Garretts to borrow what they could spare, which he did with the sociable enthusiasm he brought to any task involving other people, and came back with 14 extra jars and a dinner invitation from Mrs. Garrett that she accepted on behalf of the whole family. Supper at the Garrett table that August evening was the first time she sat down somewhere that was not the Rourke kitchen, with the sense that she was representing something, not performing, not managing an impression, but genuinely representing the family she was now part of. Mrs. Garrett's husband made a toast a brief and practical one, in the Wyoming rancher tradition, where sentiment was respected, but not belabored to the Rourke family and their good year. Silas raised his glass and looked down the table at her, past the 7 boys arranged between them, past all the noise and motion of a table full of children, eating with the dedication of people who have worked outdoors all day, and he gave her the look he had that was just for her, quiet, steady, warm, in a way that didn't require any of the words that didn't come easily to him. She raised her glass back. She had come to Wyoming with one bag, $41, and a very clear understanding that she was entering a transaction. She was leaving that table and every table after as someone for whom the word transaction no longer applied to the central fact of her life. What applied was simpler and harder and more worth having. She was home. She was known. She was in the plain and permanent way of people who have found the place they belong, exactly where she was supposed to be. The tomatoes grew. The hens laid. The account book filled with 2 sets of handwriting that had stopped being distinguishable from each other by what they meant, if not by how they looked. The boys grew, the ranch held. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the house was settling into its nighttime sounds, and the Wyoming sky went wide and dark outside the windows, she sat at the kitchen table that had been empty when she arrived, in the house that had been broken when she arrived, surrounded by the family that had been scattered when she arrived. And she thought, this is what it looks like when something that was not quite dead finds the right conditions and decides to live. She had been one of those conditions. So at every single one of them, that was the whole of it. That was enough.